Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The footsteps circling my tent weren't human. They couldn't be. The rhythm was all wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. But as I lay there, paralyzed in my sleeping bag, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was out there knew I was inside. I'd been looking forward to this solo camping trip for months. The Cascade Mountains in late summer were a hiker's paradise, and I'd found the perfect spot off the beaten path. No designated campgrounds, no noisy neighbors, just me, the towering pines, and the promise of solitude. The first day had been everything I'd hoped for. I'd set up my tent in a small clearing, the scent of pine needles and wildflowers heavy in the air. The sun filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with patches of warm light. I'd spent the afternoon exploring, my boots crunching on the carpet of fallen leaves and twigs. The only sounds were the occasional calls of birds and the gentle rustle of wind through the trees. As evening fell, I'd built a small fire, the flames casting flickering shadows across the clearing. I'd watched the stars emerge, bright pinpricks against the darkening sky, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. This was why I'd come out here, to disconnect, to breathe, to remember what it felt like to simply exist in the world without the constant noise of modern life. I'd crawled into my tent that night, muscles pleasantly sore from the day's hike, and fallen into a deep sleep almost instantly. The footsteps woke me sometime in the early hours of the morning. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it might be a deer or maybe a raccoon sniffing around my campsite. But as I became more alert, a chill ran down my spine. The steps were too heavy, too measured to be an animal. I held my breath, straining my ears. The footsteps continued their slow circuit around my tent. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were taking their time, pausing occasionally as if studying the tent's exterior. My heart hammered in my chest, so loud I was sure the intruder could hear it. I wanted to call out to challenge them, but fear had frozen my voice. What if it was a bear? But no, bears didn't move like that. A person then. But who would be out here, circling a lone camper's tent in the middle of the night? The rational part of my brain tried to come up with explanations. Maybe it was a park ranger doing a late-night patrol, but I knew I was miles from any official campgrounds or ranger stations. Perhaps another hiker had gotten lost and was looking for help, but why wouldn't they call out? As the footsteps completed another circuit, a new sound joined them. A low, guttural breathing that sent shivers through my entire body. It was almost a growl, but not quite animal. There was an intelligence behind it, a purposefulness that made it all the more terrifying. I lay there, every muscle tense as the night wore on. The footsteps continued their relentless patrol, never speeding up, never slowing down. Just that steady, deliberate pace punctuated by pauses and that awful breathing. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like hours, but time seemed to stretch and warp in the darkness. Eventually, as the first weak light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, the footsteps receded. I heard them move off into the underbrush, growing fainter until they disappeared altogether. For a long time, I didn't move. I was afraid that if I so much as twitched, the footsteps would return. But as the forest around me came to life with morning birdsong, I finally found the courage to unzip the tent and peer outside. The clearing looked exactly as I'd left it the night before. My fire pit was cold, the ashes undisturbed. My backpack leaned against a nearby tree, seemingly untouched. For a moment, I wondered if I'd dreamed the whole thing. But then I saw the footprints. They circled my tent in a perfect ring, the grass and underbrush trampled flat. I stepped out, my legs shaky, to get a closer look. The prints were like nothing I'd ever seen before, too large to be human, with strange or elongated toes that dug deep into the soft earth. Whatever had made them was heavy, and definitely not a normal forest creature. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the trail of prints with my eyes. They led away from my tent towards the denser part of the forest, disappearing into the shadows between the trees. I should have packed up right then. Should have hiked out and never looked back. But curiosity mingled with my fear. I'd always been too inquisitive for my own good, and now that same trait propelled me forward, following the strange tracks into the woods. The forest seemed different in the wake of the night's events. The cheerful birdsong took on an ominous tone, as if the birds were trying to warn me away. Shadows seemed deeper, the spaces between trees more menacing. Every snapping twig made me jump. I followed the tracks for about a quarter mile before they disappeared at the base of a massive old-growth cedar. The tree was ancient, its trunk wider than my arm span. Deep grooves ran up its bark, as if something with massive claws had used it as a scratching post. As I circled the tree, my foot caught on something. I looked down and felt the blood drain from my face. Half buried in the leaf litter was a scrap of fabric, a piece of tent material identical to mine. My hands shook as I bent to examine it. The edges were ragged, as if it had been torn away by something with incredible strength. I straightened up, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. It was as if the entire wood was holding its breath. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement in my peripheral vision. I whirled around, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I backed away from the cedar, my eyes darting from tree to tree. There it was again, movement just at the edge of my vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing. Panic rose in my throat. I turned and ran, no longer caring about stealth or tracking. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my only thought to get back to my campsite, to grab my things and get out of these woods. I burst into the clearing, gasping for breath. My tent stood there, innocent and unthreatening in the morning light. But something was different. Something was wrong. It took me a moment to realize what it was. My backpack, which I'd left leaning against a tree, was now sitting upright in front of my tent. And hanging from one of the straps was a crudely woven bracelet made of grass and twigs. With trembling hands, I approached the backpack. The bracelet was intricate, each blade of grass and twig woven together with precision, and threaded through the center was a single long, coarse hair, too thick to be human, too long to belong to any animal I knew. A twig snapped in the forest behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and covered in shaggy, matted fur. Its arms hung long at its sides, ending in hands with elongated fingers tipped with wicked claws. But it was the face that turned my blood to ice. It was almost human, but not quite. The proportions were all wrong, the features twisted into a grotesque parody of a human visage. And the eyes, God, the eyes. They were intelligent, aware, and fixed directly on me with an intensity that froze me in place. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one long-fingered hand and pointed at the bracelet hanging from my backpack. A gift, I realized with dawning horror. It had left me a gift. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth. A sound emerged. Not quite a growl, not quite speech, but somehow, I understood the message behind it. You're welcome. Then, in a movement almost too fast to follow, it turned and loped into the forest, quickly swallowed by the shadows between the trees. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. Then, moving on autopilot, I grabbed my backpack, leaving the bracelet where it hung. I didn't bother breaking down my tent or gathering the rest of my gear. I just ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. I ran until I hit the main trail, and then I ran some more. I didn't stop until I reached my car, parked at the trailhead miles away. As I fumbled with my keys, I glanced back at the forest. For a split second, I thought I saw a tall, shaggy figure standing between the trees, watching me. But I blinked, and it was gone. I drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process what had happened. Even now, months later, I'm not sure I believe it myself. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I catch a whiff of pine and wild fir, and I remember those footsteps circling my tent in the dark, leaving gifts and terror in their wake. I don't go camping alone anymore. The cabin looked abandoned, but the fresh food wrappers told a different story. As thunder rolled overhead and rain pelted the roof, I realized I wasn't alone in these woods, and whoever was here with me didn't want to be found. I've always been a bit of a loner, preferring the company of trees and mountains to that of people. So when I decided to take a week-long hiking trip through the Adirondacks, going solo felt natural. I'd mapped out a route that would take me deep into the wilderness, far from the well-trodden tourist paths. The first 3 days were blissful. I woke each morning to birdsong, spent my days trekking through lush forests and scaling rocky outcrops, and fell asleep each night under a canopy of stars. The solitude was rejuvenating, washing away months of stress and city grime. On the fourth day, the weather turned. Dark clouds rolled in, bringing with them a bone-chilling wind. I pushed on, hoping to reach my planned campsite before the storm hit. But as the first fat raindrops began to fall, I realized I'd miscalculated. I was still miles from where I'd intended to stop, with no shelter in sight. That's when I saw it, a small cabin nestled among the pines, barely visible through the deepening gloom. Relief flooded through me. Even if it was occupied, surely the owners wouldn't turn away a hiker in need of shelter from the storm. I approached the cabin, noting its weathered exterior and sagging porch. It looked like it had seen better days, perhaps an old hunting lodge fallen into disrepair. As I got closer, I noticed there were no lights on inside, no smoke rising from the chimney. My spirits fell. It was probably abandoned, and likely in no better shape inside than out. Still, any shelter was better than none. I climbed the creaky steps and knocked on the door, more out of habit than expectation. When no one answered, I tested the handle. To my surprise, it turned easily. "Hello?" I called out as I pushed the door open. "Anyone here? Sorry to intrude, but I need to get out of this storm." Silence greeted me, broken only by the steadily increasing patter of rain on the roof. I stepped inside, fumbling for the flashlight in my pack. As the beam swept across the interior, I felt a mix of relief and unease. The cabin was Spartan but intact. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a couple of worn armchairs facing it. A small kitchen area occupied one corner, and I could see a door that presumably led to a bedroom. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, confirming my initial impression that the place was abandoned. But then my light fell on the kitchen table, and my heart skipped a beat. There, amid the dust and grime, was a scatter of fresh food wrappers, a half-empty bag of chips, candy bar wrappers, the packaging from a pack of beef jerky. These weren't old. The plastic still held its shape, the colors bright and unfaded. Someone had been here, and recently. I stood frozen, listening intently, but there was nothing to hear beyond the storm outside, which had now risen to a fever pitch. Wind howled around the eaves, and rain lashed against the windows. If there was anyone else moving around inside the cabin, the storm would have covered the sound. For a moment, I considered leaving, braving the elements rather than risk an encounter with whoever had left those wrappers. But a flash of lightning followed by an immediate crack of thunder made the decision for me. The storm was directly overhead, and I knew from experience how dangerous these mountain thunderstorms could be. I was stuck here, at least until the worst passed. I shrugged off my pack and began to make myself at home, all the while keeping an ear out for any sound that might indicate I wasn't alone. I found some old dry wood stacked near the fireplace and managed to get a small fire going. Its warmth was welcome after the chill of the rain, and the flickering light it cast made the cabin feel a bit less eerie. As I sat in one of the armchairs, warming my hands by the fire, I tried to make sense of the situation. The cabin looked like it hadn't been used in years, yet there was clear evidence someone had been here recently. Were they hikers like me, seeking shelter from the storm? But then why leave in such a hurry that they'd abandon their food? A darker possibility crept into my mind. What if they hadn't left? What if they were still here, hiding, watching me? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. I was letting my imagination run wild, spooking myself like a kid telling ghost stories around a campfire. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting stronger. I realized I might be in for a long night and decided to explore the cabin more thoroughly, partly out of curiosity, partly to reassure myself I was truly alone. The kitchen area yielded nothing beyond the wrappers I'd already seen. The cupboards were bare save for a few cans, so old their labels had faded to illegibility. I did, however, find a large jug of water that looked relatively clean. At least I wouldn't go thirsty. I turned my attention to the closed door I'd noticed earlier. Taking a deep breath, I grasped the handle and pushed it open, my flashlight beam piercing the darkness beyond. It was, as I'd guessed, a bedroom. A large bed dominated the space, its sheets musty but otherwise intact. A dresser stood against one wall, and a small writing desk occupied the corner. But what caught my eye was the closet door, which stood slightly ajar. My palms began to sweat as I approached it. This was how every horror movie went wrong. The protagonist, investigating a creepy noise or half-open door. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I yanked the closet door open in one swift motion, my flashlight ready to illuminate whatever lurked inside. But there was nothing. Just a few old coats hanging forlornly and a pair of boots so worn they were more hole than shoe. I let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over me. I was being ridiculous. There was no one here but me. That's when I heard it. A creak from the main room, like someone shifting their weight on an old floorboard. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It could have been the cabin settling, I told myself. Old buildings made all sorts of noises, especially in storms like this. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The sound had been too distinct, too deliberate. Slowly, I crept back towards the bedroom door. My flashlight beam danced wildly as my hand shook. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, unmistakably, I heard footsteps. Slow, cautious, but definitely there. Someone was moving around in the main room of the cabin. Panic clawed at my throat. I was trapped. The bedroom had no other exit, no windows large enough to climb through. The only way out was through that door, past whoever was out there. My mind raced. Should I confront them, call out, or stay hidden and hope they left? But even as I considered my options, the decision was made for me. The bedroom door handle began to turn. I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall beside the door. My heart pounding so hard I was sure it could be heard over the storm. The door swung open, and a beam of light swept across the room. "I know you're in here," a gruff voice called out. "No use hiding. Come on out where I can see you." I remained frozen, barely daring to breathe. The light moved methodically around the room, illuminating every corner. It was only a matter of time before it found me. In that moment, I made a desperate decision. As the beam of light swung towards me, I lunged forward, slamming my body into the door. I heard a grunt of surprise as it connected with something solid, and then I was running, bursting into the main room of the cabin. I didn't stop to look back, didn't pause to grab my pack. I just ran, yanking open the cabin door and plunging into the storm outside. Rain lashed at my face and nearly blinding me, but I kept going. I could hear shouts behind me, but they were quickly swallowed by the howling wind. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. I ran until I couldn't hear anything but the storm and my own ragged breathing. Only then did I dare to stop, to lean against a tree and try to get my bearings. I was lost, soaked to the bone, and without any of my gear. But I was alive, and free from whoever had been in that cabin. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full weight of my situation settled in. I was in serious trouble. But that was a problem for later. For now, I had to keep moving. I picked a direction and started walking, pushing through the underbrush, always listening for any sign of pursuit. The storm raged on, and somewhere behind me, a cabin in the woods held secrets I never wanted to uncover. I'd gone looking for solitude in these mountains, but I'd found something else entirely, a mystery and a danger that would haunt me long after I found my way back to civilization. As I trudged through the rain, one thought kept repeating in my mind. Sometimes, it's not the isolation of the wilderness we should fear, but what or who might be hiding in it. The moment he mentioned my dog's name, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. As my fingers tightened on the steering wheel, I realized this wasn't just another hitchhiker, and our journey was about to take a dark turn. I've always been the kind of person who believes in the goodness of others. Maybe that's naive, especially in this day and age, but it's a part of me I've never wanted to change. So when I saw him standing on the side of that dusty Arizona highway, thumb out, looking weary and sun-beaten, I didn't think twice about stopping. The day had started like any other. I was on my way back to Tucson after visiting my sister in Phoenix, a drive I'd made countless times before. The desert stretched out endlessly on either side of the road, shimmering in the late afternoon heat. I had the windows down, country music playing softly on the radio, and a cooler full of water bottles in the back seat. It was peaceful, almost meditative. That's when I saw him. He was standing just past a bend in the road, his figure distorted by the heat waves rising from the asphalt. As I got closer, I could see he was middle-aged, with a weathered face and clothes that had seen better days. He didn't look dangerous, just tired and in need of a break from the relentless sun. I slowed down, pulling onto the shoulder a few yards ahead of him. In my rearview mirror, I watched him jog towards the car, a grateful smile on his face. I reached over and unlocked the passenger door. "Thanks for stopping," he said, as he climbed in, his voice gravelly from the dry air. "Not many people would, these days." "No problem," I replied, pulling back onto the highway. "Where are you headed?" "Tucson, if you're going that far," he said. "Name's Jake, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Jake. I'm Sarah," I said, keeping my eyes on the road. "And yeah, I'm heading to Tucson. You're in luck." We fell into easy conversation as the miles rolled by. Jake told me he'd been traveling for a while, picking up odd jobs here and there. He had a way of talking that put me at ease, sharing funny stories about his travels and asking me questions about my life. It wasn't until we were about an hour into the drive that I started to notice something odd. Jake's questions were becoming more specific, more personal. He asked about my job, and before I could give more than a vague answer, he said, "That software company downtown, right? Must be nice working so close to that little cafe you like." I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't mentioned where I worked, or anything about a cafe. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I must have said more than I remembered, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Then came the comment about my dog. We'd been talking about pets, and I'd mentioned I had a dog, but nothing more. Suddenly, Jake said, "I bet Max loves that dog park near your place. Great spot for a golden retriever." My blood ran cold. I'd never told him my dog's name, or his breed. or anything about a dog park. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked, "How did you know that?" Jake's demeanor changed in an instant. The friendly smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Oh, Sarah," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I know a lot more than that." My mind raced. Who was this man? How did he know so much about me? And more importantly, what did he want? I tried to stay calm, to think rationally. We were still at least an hour from Tucson, surrounded by nothing but desert. If I panicked now, things could go very badly. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, hating how my voice shook. Jake chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Let's just say I've been waiting a long time to meet you, Sarah. You should really be more careful about what you post online. You never know who might be watching." A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't a chance encounter. This man, this stranger I'd let into my car, had been stalking me. Every instinct screamed at me to stop the car, to run. But where would I go? There was nothing around us for miles. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to buy time, to figure out a way out of this nightmare. "Oh, we'll get to that," Jake said, reaching into his pocket. I flinched, expecting a weapon, but he pulled out a phone instead. "For now, just keep driving, and don't try anything stupid. I'd hate for anything to happen to your sister in Phoenix, or your parents back in Illinois." The threat was clear. Somehow, this man knew everything about me, about my family. I felt trapped, cornered in my own car as it sped down the empty highway. For the next half hour, we drove in tense silence. Jake kept his eyes on me, that cold smile never leaving his face. I ran through scenarios in my head, trying to figure out a way to escape, to get help. But every plan seemed doomed to failure. As we approached a small town, little more than a gas station and a diner, Jake finally spoke again. "Pull over here. We need to have a chat about what happens next." I complied, my hands shaking as I guided the car into the gas station. As soon as I put it in park, Jake reached over and snatched the keys from the ignition. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice eerily calm. "You're going to go inside and buy us some snacks. Act normal. If you try to ask for help or signal anyone, well, let's just say I have friends who are keeping a very close eye on your loved ones right now. Understand?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I got out of the car on shaky legs, Jake called out, "Oh, and Sarah, don't forget to fill up the tank. We've got a long drive ahead of us." The fluorescent lights of the gas station felt harsh after the dim interior of the car. I moved on autopilot, grabbing bottles of water and bags of chips. The bored-looking cashier barely glanced at me as I paid. I wanted to scream, to beg for help, but the thought of what might happen to my family kept me silent. As I walked back to the car, my mind was whirling. This couldn't be happening. How had a simple act of kindness turned into this waking nightmare? I was about to open the driver's side door when I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The tires. All four of them were flat. For a moment, I just stood there staring in disbelief. Then I heard Jake's voice, sharp and angry. "What the hell?" He got out of the car, his face twisted in rage as he saw the flat tires. In that moment of confusion, I made a split-second decision. I turned and ran. I sprinted towards the diner, my legs pumping harder than they ever had before. I could hear Jake shouting behind me, his footsteps pounding on the asphalt. The diner's door seemed impossibly far away. Just as I reached for the handle, I felt Jake's hand close around my arm. He yanked me back, spinning me around to face him. His eyes were wild, filled with a fury that made me shrink back in terror. "You think you can run from me?" he snarled, his fingers digging painfully into my arm. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Sarah. No idea at all." But before he could say anything else, the diner's door burst open. A large man in a trucker's cap stepped out, taking in the scene before him with narrowed eyes. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his voice deep and suspicious. Jake's grip on my arm loosened slightly. I saw my chance and took it. "Help me!" I cried, wrenching myself free and stumbling towards the trucker. "Please, he's been stalking me. He knows everything about me. I don't know what to do." The trucker's expression hardened as he stepped between me and Jake. "I think you'd better leave, buddy," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jake looked from the trucker to me, his face a mask of cold fury. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might try to fight, but then, without a word, he turned and ran, disappearing around the side of the gas station. The next few hours passed in a blur. The police were called, statements were taken. They searched the area but found no sign of Jake. My car was towed, the tires mysteriously slashed by an unknown assailant. As I sat in the sheriff's office, a shock blanket around my shoulders, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The kindness I'd always prided myself on had nearly cost me everything. The world suddenly seemed darker, more dangerous. But as I watched the sun setting over the desert through the office window, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let this experience change who I was at my core. I would be more cautious, yes, but I wouldn't let fear rule my life. The hitchhiker on the lonely desert highway had taught me a harsh lesson, but in the end, it was also the kindness of a stranger, the trucker who intervened, that had saved me. In this vast, sometimes frightening world, both danger and salvation can come from unexpected places. As I prepared to call my sister for a ride, I took a deep breath. The ordeal was over, but its echoes would linger. I knew I had a long journey ahead, not just back home, but towards reclaiming my sense of safety and trust. But I was alive, and I was free. And for now, that was enough. The tiny red light blinked at me from behind a tree, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't a firefly. It wasn't a reflection. It was a camera, and I had a sickening feeling it wasn't the only one watching me. I'd always been a bit of a loner, preferring the company of nature to the chaos of the city. That's why I'd decided to take a week-long solo camping trip in the Ozarks. Just me, my tent, and miles of unspoiled wilderness. Or so I thought. The first 2 days were blissful. I hiked through dense forests, the canopy above filtering the sunlight into a gentle green glow. I set up camp near a burbling stream, falling asleep each night to the sound of water over rocks and the distant hoot of owls. It was exactly the escape I'd been craving. On the third day, I decided to explore a less traveled path. The trail was overgrown, barely visible in places, but that only added to the sense of adventure. I pushed through thick underbrush, ducking under low-hanging branches, feeling like a true explorer. That's when I saw it. A flash of metal in the undergrowth, out of place among the leaves and twigs. Curious, I knelt down to investigate. My heart skipped a beat as I brushed aside the foliage to reveal a small, sophisticated-looking camera. It was well hidden, its casing designed to blend in with the forest floor. But there was no mistaking the lens, or the tiny red light indicating it was active. I stood up quickly, suddenly feeling exposed. Why would there be a camera out here, miles from any marked trail or campsite? My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was for wildlife research, but if so, why hide it so carefully? I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself I was overreacting. I snapped a quick picture of the camera with my phone, thinking I'd ask a park ranger about it when I got back to civilization. Then I continued on my hike, trying to recapture the peace I'd felt earlier. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every snapping twig, made me whirl around, half expecting to see someone lurking behind a tree. By the time I made it back to my campsite, my nerves were frayed. As I started to prepare dinner, movement caught my eye. There, partially hidden by a fallen log, was another camera. This one was aimed directly at my tent. My hands shook as I approached it. This was no coincidence. Someone had deliberately placed these cameras. Someone who knew I would be here. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was being monitored. I spent a sleepless night in my tent, jumping at every sound. My mind conjured up terrifying scenarios. Was I the subject of some twisted reality show? Was someone hunting me for sport? Or was it something even darker? When dawn finally broke, I made a decision. I had to find out what was going on. I packed a day bag and set out, determined to scour the area around my campsite. I moved slowly, methodically, checking every bush, every tree, every rocky outcropping. By midday, I had found 5 more cameras, each more cunningly hidden than the last. They formed a perimeter around my camp, covering every approach. Whoever had placed them knew what they were doing. As I documented the location of each camera, a pattern emerged. They seemed to be leading away from my campsite, forming a trail of their own. With a mixture of dread and determination, I decided to follow it. The path led me deeper into the forest, to areas I hadn't explored yet. Every few hundred yards, I'd find another camera. Some were obvious, almost like breadcrumbs meant to be found. Others were so well hidden that I only spotted them by chance. The sun was starting to dip towards the horizon when I found it. A small clearing, unremarkable except for the tent pitched in its center. My heart raced as I approached. It looked recently used, with muddy boot prints leading in and out. I called out, half hoping for a response, half dreading one. Silence was my only answer. Gathering my courage, I unzipped the tent flap and peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The tent was empty of people, but it was far from empty. One entire side was taken up by sophisticated-looking computer equipment. Monitors displayed feeds from what I assumed were the cameras I'd found. And there, in the center of it all, was a corkboard covered in photos. Photos of me. Me setting up my tent. Me cooking dinner. Me sleeping. Dozens of images, documenting my every move since I'd arrived in these woods. And in the center, a map of the area with my campsite circled in red. I staggered back, my mind reeling. This was no chance encounter, no random act of voyeurism. This was planned, meticulous, terrifying in its thoroughness. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, his expression a mixture of surprise and anger. He was ordinary looking, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second glance. But the hunting knife in his hand was anything but ordinary. "You weren't supposed to find this place," he said, his voice eerily calm. "You've ruined everything." I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the knife. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Why does anyone do anything? For the thrill, the challenge, the game. Game. The word echoed in my head. This man, this monster, saw my life as nothing more than entertainment. "Please," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear." He shook his head, almost sadly. "I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, the game isn't over yet." He lunged forward, the knife flashing in the fading sunlight. I reacted on pure instinct, throwing my backpack at him. It caught him in the chest, making him stumble. I didn't wait to see if he fell. I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps steady and determined. He knew these woods, I realized with growing horror. He'd been watching me, studying my movements. This was his territory. I ran blindly, with no idea which direction would lead me to safety. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. Every time I thought I'd lost him, I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle and know he was still on my trail. As the light faded, my chances of escape seemed to dim with it. I was lost, exhausted, and being hunted by a madman who knew every inch of this forest. Despair threatened to overwhelm me. Then I saw it. A flicker of light through the trees. Firelight. My campsite. Hope surged through me, giving me a final burst of energy. I sprinted towards the light, branches scratching my arms, my feet slipping on the leaf-strewn ground. I burst into the clearing, making a beeline for my tent. My car keys were in there. If I could just reach them. I dove into the tent, frantically searching for my keys. Behind me, I could hear him entering the clearing, his breathing heavy but controlled. My fingers closed around the keys just as a hand grabbed my ankle. I kicked out, feeling my foot connect with something solid. There was a grunt of pain, and the grip on my ankle loosened. I scrambled out of the tent, keys clutched tightly in my hand. The man was on the ground, clutching his face where I'd kicked him. The knife lay just out of his reach. For a moment, we locked eyes. I saw the rage there, the frustration of a predator whose prey was escaping. Then I turned and ran for my car. My hands shook as I tried to unlock the door. Behind me, I could hear him getting to his feet. The key slid home, and I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside. I jammed the key into the ignition, silently praying to whatever might be listening. The engine roared to life just as a hand slammed against my window. I didn't look. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning in the dirt. The hand slipped away as I accelerated, the car fishtailing as I turned it around. I sped down the dirt road, not daring to slow down until I hit pavement. Only then, with miles between me and that nightmare in the woods, did I let myself breathe. I drove straight to the nearest police station, my story spilling out in a jumbled rush. They were skeptical at first, but the photos on my phone and the wild look in my eyes must have convinced them. They sent out search parties, but by the time they reached my campsite, it was empty. The cameras were gone, the mysterious tent had vanished, and there was no sign of the man who had hunted me. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear footsteps outside my window. I see flashing red lights in the shadows and imagine hidden cameras watching my every move. The woods that once brought me peace now fill me with dread. But I won't let him win. I won't let fear rule my life. I'm telling my story, hoping that it might save someone else from falling into the same trap. Because out there, in the wilderness we think is untouched, someone might be watching. And the next camera you spot might be more than just a hidden eye. It might be the first clue that you've become part of someone's twisted game. The abandoned tent flapped in the breeze, its torn fabric a silent witness to whatever violence had occurred here. As I stood there, my backpack suddenly heavy on my shoulders, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Little did I know, my curiosity was about to lead me into a nightmare I might never escape. I've always loved hiking the Appalachian Trail. There's something about the ancient mountains, the dense forests, and the sense of history that speaks to my soul. I'd been planning this solo trip for months, eager to disconnect from the world and reconnect with nature. The first few days had been everything I'd hoped for, challenging hikes, breathtaking views, and the kind of solitude that clears your mind and refreshes your spirit. It was on the fourth day that everything changed. I'd veered off the main trail, following a less traveled path that promised a view of a hidden waterfall. The forest was thick here, the canopy overhead casting everything in a greenish twilight. The only sounds were my boots crunching on fallen leaves and the occasional call of a bird. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just an oddly shaped bush, but as I got closer, I realized it was a tent, or what was left of one. It was a sorry sight, the fabric ripped and muddy, one of the poles snapped clean in half. The zipper on the entrance flap was open, and I could see what looked like clothes and gear scattered inside. My first thought was that a bear had gotten to it. It wouldn't be the first time a careless camper had attracted unwanted attention. But as I approached, I noticed things that didn't fit that theory. There was no scattered food, no claw marks on the fabric. This damage looked deliberate. I called out, thinking that maybe the tent's owner was nearby. "Hello? Anyone there? Do you need help?" My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet forest, but there was no response. I should have turned back then, should have hiked to the nearest ranger station and reported what I'd found. But curiosity got the better of me. I'd always had a bit of a detective streak, and the mystery of this abandoned campsite tugged at me. I set my backpack down and began to examine the scene more closely. The clothes inside the tent were strewn about, as if someone had left in a hurry. A hiking boot lay on its side, caked with dried mud. A water bottle rolled across the tent floor as a gust of wind shook the fabric. Something glinted in the leaf litter near the tent entrance. I bent down to look closer and felt my breath catch in my throat. It was a small pendant on a broken chain, a silver heart, smeared with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. My heart started to race. This was no longer just a strange campsite. Something bad had happened here. I stood up quickly, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. No bird calls, no rustling in the underbrush. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. That's when I saw the drag marks. Leading away from the tent, through the fallen leaves and into the undergrowth, was a clear trail where something, or someone, had been pulled. Without thinking, I began to follow it. The trail led deeper into the forest, away from any marked paths. Branches scratched at my face and arms as I pushed through, my eyes fixed on the disturbed ground in front of me. I don't know how long I walked, my mind spinning with increasingly terrifying scenarios. The drag marks ended abruptly at the base of a large oak tree. I looked around, confused, before I noticed a scrap of fabric caught on a low branch. It matched the color of the ruined tent. A twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. There was nothing there, just trees and shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. "Hello," I called out again, hating how my voice shook. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Then, so quiet I almost missed it. A whisper of movement to my left. I turned slowly, my eyes straining to see through the dim forest light. For a split second, I saw a figure, just a glimpse, a shadow darker than the others, moving between the trees. Then it was gone. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, no longer caring about stealth or tracking. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my only thought to get back to the main trail, back to safety. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. Every sound became a pursuer, every shadow a threat. When I finally burst out onto the main trail, I nearly cried with relief. But my ordeal wasn't over. As I stood there, gasping for breath, I realized I had no idea which way led back to civilization. In my panic, I'd lost all sense of direction. I was lost. The sun was starting to set, the forest growing darker by the minute. I knew I needed to find shelter, but the thought of spending the night out here, with whatever, or whoever, was in these woods, filled me with dread. I picked a direction and started walking, trying to move quickly while still watching for trail markers. The shadows lengthened, trees turning into looming monsters in the twilight. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me jump. That's when I heard it. A voice, carried on the wind. I froze, listening intently. It came again, a faint call that might have been my name. Relief flooded through me. Someone was looking for me. I was saved. "Here," I shouted. "I'm over here." I waited for a response, but there was only silence. Had I imagined it? The forest played tricks on you, especially when you were scared and tired. I was about to start walking again when I heard it once more. Definitely a voice, definitely calling out. But this time, I wasn't so sure it was my name. and something about the tone sent a chill down my spine. The voice was closer now, and I could hear footsteps accompanying it, but they didn't sound right. The rhythm was off, like whoever it was dragging something heavy. Suddenly, the events of the day snapped into terrible focus. The ruined tent, the drag marks, the shadowy figure in the woods. This wasn't a rescue, it was a hunt, and I was the prey. I ran. I ran like I've never run before, my pack bouncing painfully against my back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear pursuit behind me, the footsteps faster now, gaining on me. A root caught my foot and I went down hard, scrambling back up with my hands scraped and bleeding. Just ahead, I saw a flicker of light through the trees. A campfire. Other hikers. Safety. I put on a final burst of speed, my legs burning with the effort. I burst into the clearing, startling the couple sitting by the fire. "Help!" I gasped. "Please, someone's after me." They jumped up, the man grabbing a heavy stick from near the fire. "What's going on?" he demanded, peering into the darkness behind me. I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a rushed, garbled mess. The abandoned tent, the drag marks, the voice in the woods. As I spoke, I realized how crazy it all sounded. The couple exchanged a look I knew all too well, concern mixed with doubt. But then we all heard it, a twig snapping in the darkness just beyond the firelight. Then another. Something was out there, circling the camp. The woman pulled out a cell phone, they had reception here, thank God, and called for help. The man stood with his makeshift weapon, tense and alert. I huddled close to the fire, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. We spent a tense hour like that, jumping at every sound, before we heard the blessed noise of a helicopter. The forest around us lit up with searchlights, and I nearly wept with relief when I saw the rangers approaching through the trees. The woods were searched, but they never found anyone. No sign of the ruined tent, no evidence of the drag marks I'd followed. If I hadn't been so obviously terrified, I think they might have written the whole thing off as an overactive imagination. I gave my statement to the police, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. How could I blame them? It all seemed so unreal in the harsh light of day. I went home the next day, my hiking trip cut short, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd had a narrow escape. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that shadowy figure moving through the trees, still hear that voice calling out, so close to my name but not quite right. I don't go hiking alone anymore. The solitude I once craved now feels dangerous, but I can't stay away from the mountains entirely. There's still something that calls to me about those ancient forests. So I go back, but always with a group, always on the marked trails. And if sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I think I see a shadow moving where no shadow should be, well, I just walk a little faster and stay a little closer to my companions. Because I know now that in the deep woods, where the trail grows faint and the trees grow thick, there are some mysteries better left unsolved. The moment their smiles turned cold, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. What had started as a peaceful solo hike in Yosemite was about to become a fight for survival against two strangers who were anything but friendly. I've always loved the solitude of nature, the way it strips away the complexities of modern life and leaves you with nothing but your thoughts and the wilderness around you. That's why I decided to take a week-long solo hiking trip in Yosemite National Park. I'd been there before, but always on the popular trails, surrounded by other hikers and tourists. This time, I wanted to experience the real Yosemite, the parts that most visitors never see. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. I hiked through meadows bursting with wildflowers, climbed rocky outcroppings that offered breathtaking views of the valley, and slept under a canopy of stars so bright it seemed unreal. I felt more alive than I had in years, my body tired but my spirit soaring. On the fourth day, I decided to explore a lesser-known trail that one of the park rangers had mentioned. It was a challenging hike, he'd said, but the views were unparalleled. I set out early, my backpack loaded with supplies, excitement thrumming through me at the prospect of new adventures. The trail was indeed challenging, steep and rocky in places, overgrown in others, but the solitude was perfect. I didn't see another soul all morning, just the occasional deer or squirrel darting across my path. By mid-afternoon, I was deep in a part of the park I'd never seen before, surrounded by towering sequoias and the constant murmur of a nearby stream. That's when I saw them, a couple, probably in their early 30s, sitting on a fallen log beside the trail. They looked as surprised to see me as I was to see them. The woman waved, a friendly smile on her face, and I felt a surge of relief. As much as I enjoyed solitude, it was nice to see another human face after days alone. "Hey there!" the man called out as I approached. "Didn't expect to see anyone else out here." I smiled back, slowing my pace. "Me neither. It's been pretty quiet out here." They introduced themselves as Mike and Sarah, avid hikers who, like me, had wanted to experience the less touristy side of Yosemite. We chatted easily, swapping stories about our experiences in the park. They were charming and funny, and I found myself relaxing in their company. "We were just about to stop for a late lunch," Sarah said. "Would you like to join us? We've got plenty to share." I hesitated for a moment. My mother's voice echoed in my head, warning me about stranger danger, but these two seemed harmless enough, and the thought of some company was appealing after days of solitude. Plus, they had fresh fruit, which sounded heavenly after days of trail mix and energy bars. "Sure," I said. "That would be great." We moved a little way off the trail to a small clearing with a stunning view of a nearby waterfall. As we ate, the conversation flowed easily. They asked me about my job, my hobbies, where I was from. I found myself opening up, telling them things I rarely shared with strangers. There was something about the setting, the isolation, that made it feel safe to do so. But as the afternoon wore on, I began to notice subtle changes in their behavior. Their questions became more probing, more personal. They wanted to know if anyone knew where I was, if I was meeting anyone at the end of my hike. Mike's eyes, which had seemed warm and friendly before, now held a calculating gleam that made me uneasy. I started making excuses to leave, gathering my things and talking about the long hike ahead of me. But every time I tried to go, they'd find a reason for me to stay a little longer. Sarah's hand on my arm, ostensibly friendly, felt more like a warning. "You know," Mike said, his voice casual but his eyes intent, "it's getting pretty late. The trail can be dangerous in the dark. Why don't you camp with us tonight? Safety in numbers and all that." A chill ran down my spine. He was right about the dangers of hiking in the dark, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from these people. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks, but I really should get going. I've got a GPS and a good headlamp. I'll be fine." I stood up, slinging my backpack over my shoulder. That's when I saw it, the flash of metal in Mike's hand as he pulled something from his pocket. My heart nearly stopped when I realized it was a knife. "I'm afraid we can't let you do that," he said, all pretense of friendliness gone. "You see, we've got plans, and they don't involve letting you walk away." Sarah stood up too, and I saw she was holding what looked like a length of rope. The friendly couple had vanished, replaced by two predators who had me cornered. My mind raced, trying to figure a way out of this nightmare. I was in good shape from days of hiking, but I was also tired, and they were between me and the trail. I glanced at the steep slope behind me, leading down towards the sound of the stream I'd heard earlier. "Look," I said, taking a step backwards. "I don't want any trouble. Just let me go, and I won't say anything to anyone. I swear." Mike laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the clearing. "Well, we know you won't say anything. That's kind of the point." He lunged at me then, the knife glinting in the late afternoon sun. I reacted on pure instinct, throwing my heavy backpack at him with all my strength. It caught him in the chest, sending him stumbling backwards. I didn't wait to see if he fell. I turned and ran, not for the trail, but for the steep slope behind me. I heard Sarah shout and Mike curse as I plunged down the hillside. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me at every step, but I kept going. Behind me, I could hear them crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. The slope grew steeper, the ground looser. I was half running, half sliding, using trees to control my descent. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. The sound of the stream grew louder, and suddenly I burst out of the trees onto a rocky bank. The stream was larger than I'd thought, fast-moving and swollen with spring melt. On the other side, I could see the trail winding its way along the opposite bank. If I could just get across. I heard Mike and Sarah getting closer and knew I was out of time. Without letting myself think about it, I plunged into the icy water. The current was stronger than I'd expected, immediately sweeping me off my feet. I gasped as the cold hit me, fighting to keep my head above water. Rocks battered my legs and sides as I was carried downstream. I could hear Mike and Sarah shouting, their voices fading as the river carried me away. I don't know how long I was in the water. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Finally, I managed to grab onto a low-hanging branch and pull myself to the shore. I lay there on the rocky bank, gasping for air, my whole body shaking with cold and adrenaline. But I couldn't stay there. I forced myself to my feet, looking around wildly for any sign of Mike and Sarah. The forest was quiet except for the rush of the stream and my own ragged breathing. I picked a direction and started walking, then running, putting as much distance between myself and that terrible clearing as I could. As the sun began to set, I finally heard what I'd been praying for. Voices. Lots of them. I stumbled out onto a popular trail, nearly collapsing at the feet of a startled family of hikers. Through chattering teeth, I managed to gasp out my story. The next few hours passed in a blur. Park rangers were called, statements were taken, search parties were organized. They never found Mike and Sarah, though they did find the clearing where I'd met them, evidence of their camp hidden nearby. I left Yosemite the next day, my love for solo hiking shattered. For weeks afterward, I jumped at every shadow, saw danger in every friendly face. It took time, and therapy, before I could even think about the outdoors without panicking. But slowly, I've started to reclaim my love for nature. I still hike, but never alone now. I go with friends, stick to popular trails, always let someone know where I'll be. The deep wilderness still calls to me, but now I know its beauty hides dangers I'd never imagined. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see Mike's friendly smile turning cold, still feel the icy rush of the stream that saved my life. Those memories may never fully fade, but they've taught me a valuable lesson. In the wilderness, trust your instincts. They just might save your life. The moment I pulled back the threadbare rug and saw the outline of a trapdoor, I knew my peaceful writing retreat was about to take a sinister turn. What I found beneath those floorboards would haunt me for years to come. I'd always dreamed of being a novelist, spinning tales of mystery and intrigue that would keep readers up all night. But between my day job and the constant distractions of city life, I could never seem to find the time or focus to finish my first book. That's why, when I stumbled across an ad for a remote cabin rental in the mountains, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. A month alone in the wilderness, just me and my laptop. Surely I could finally bring my story to life. The cabin was everything I'd hoped for, rustic, secluded, and charmingly weathered. It sat at the end of a long, winding dirt road, surrounded by towering pines and with a view of a crystal-clear lake in the distance. As I lugged my suitcase and box of supplies up the creaky wooden steps, I felt a sense of excitement and possibility that I hadn't experienced in years. The interior was cozy, if a bit dated. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by sagging bookshelves filled with dusty paperbacks. The kitchen was small but functional, and a narrow staircase led up to a loft bedroom. It was perfect. No TV, no internet, nothing to distract me from my writing. For the first few days, everything was bliss. I'd wake with the sun, make a pot of strong coffee, and write for hours on the cabin's small porch, the crisp mountain air filling my lungs and clearing my mind. In the evenings, I'd read by the fire, occasionally glancing up to watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. I was making real progress on my novel, the words flowing easier than they ever had before. It was on the fourth night that things began to change. I was up late, pacing the living room as I worked through a particularly tricky plot point. As I turned near the fireplace, a floorboard creaked loudly under my foot. I paused, curious. The sound was different from the usual groans of the old cabin, hollower somehow. I knelt down, running my hands over the worn wooden planks. There was definitely something off about this section of the floor. It felt uneven. I noticed the edge of a small rug I hadn't paid much attention to before. Acting on a hunch, I pulled it back. My breath caught in my throat. There, barely visible in the dim firelight, was the outline of a trapdoor. For a moment, I just stared at it, my mind racing. Why would there be a hidden door in a rental cabin? What could possibly be down there? The rational part of my brain said to leave it alone, to respect the property owner's privacy. But the writer in me, the part always hungry for a good story, couldn't resist. With trembling hands, I grasped the iron ring set into the wood and pulled. The door opened with a groan, revealing a set of narrow stairs descending into darkness. The musty smell of long, undisturbed air wafted up, making me wrinkle my nose. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight. Taking a deep breath, I started down the stairs. The basement was small and cluttered, filled with dusty boxes and old furniture draped in sheets. But it was the table in the center of the room that drew my attention. It was covered in papers, some yellowed with age, others crisp and new. As I moved closer, my phone's light revealed photos scattered among the documents. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was seeing. The photos were of people, men, women, even a few children. But they weren't normal photos. These showed people bound, gagged, terror evident in their eyes. Some were clearly injured, bruises darkening their skin. I felt bile rise in my throat as I forced myself to look at the papers. They were notes, detailed accounts of abductions, torture, things so horrific I couldn't bear to read more than a few lines. My hands shook as I set down one paper and picked up another. This one was newer, the ink still fresh. It described plans for another abduction, with dates and locations. With a jolt of horror, I realized the date listed was just 2 days away. I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sick joke, or maybe props for a movie. But deep down, I knew the truth. The cabin I'd thought was my writer's paradise was actually the lair of a monster. I had to get out of there. I had to call the police. I turned to rush back up the stairs and froze. There, silhouetted at the top of the staircase, was a figure. A man's voice, low and menacing, broke the silence. "You shouldn't be down here." Panic seized me. I looked around wildly for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. But I was trapped, cornered in this basement of horrors. The man started down the stairs, each slow step making the old wood creak ominously. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I backed away, bumping into the table and sending papers fluttering to the floor. "I'm sorry," I stammered, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I'll leave, I swear. I won't tell anyone." He chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Ugh, I know you won't." As he reached the bottom of the stairs, I caught my first clear glimpse of him in the light of my dropped phone. He was ordinary looking, the kind of man you'd pass on the street without a second glance. But his eyes were cold, lifeless, like a shark's. He bent down and picked up my phone, glancing at the screen before pocketing it. "No service out here," he said casually, as if we were discussing the weather. "Shame, really, but it does make my work so much easier." My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. Maybe if I could keep him talking, distract him somehow. "Why?" I asked, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "Why do you do this?" He cocked his head, regarding me with something like curiosity. "Why does anyone do anything? For the thrill? The power?" He smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "For the art of it." He took a step towards me, and I knew I was out of time. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy old book, and hurled it at his head. It caught him off guard, striking him in the face. He stumbled, cursing, and I saw my chance. I bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. I could hear him behind me, recovering quickly. As I reached the top, I slammed the trapdoor shut, hearing a satisfying thud and howl of pain as it struck him. I ran for the front door, not bothering with my belongings. All that mattered was getting away. I burst out into the cool night air, the gravel of the driveway crunching under my bare feet as I sprinted for my car. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Behind me, I heard the cabin door slam open. With a roar, the engine came to life, and I floored it, tires spinning on the loose gravel before finding purchase. As I sped down the winding road, my headlights illuminated a figure in my rearview mirror. The man stood in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. Even from a distance, I could see that terrible smile. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached the nearest police station. The officers were skeptical at first, but something in my wild-eyed and terrified demeanor must have convinced them. They sent out patrol cars, then state troopers, then finally the FBI. They found the cabin, found the basement with its horrific contents, but the man was gone, vanished, along with some of the most damning evidence. The investigation is ongoing, but I don't have much hope they'll catch him. He seemed too smart, too prepared. I've moved since then, changed my name. I'm looking over my shoulder constantly, jumping at every shadow. I've started writing again, but not the novel I'd planned. Instead, I'm writing this, my account of what happened. A warning, I suppose. Because I know he's still out there. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that smile, still hear his voice. "For the art of it," he'd said. And I can't shake the feeling that, in his twisted mind, I'm now part of that art, an unfinished piece. So I keep writing, keep telling my story. Because maybe, just maybe, it'll help someone else avoid the fate I so narrowly escaped. And perhaps, in the telling, I'll finally be free of the nightmare I discovered beneath those cabin floorboards. The flickering light in the distance wasn't a star or a fellow camper's fire. It was something else entirely, something that grew closer each night, bringing with it a terror I never thought possible. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, to the quiet solitude of nature untouched by human hands. That's why I decided to spend a week camping in a remote part of the forest, far from the designated campgrounds and well-worn trails. I wanted to experience true isolation, to test my skills and maybe find some inspiration for my writing. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. I hiked deep into the woods, the sounds of civilization fading away with each step. By late afternoon, I found the perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing near a bubbling stream, surrounded by towering pines. As I pitched my tent and gathered firewood, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was exactly what I needed. That night, as I sat by my campfire watching the stars come out, I noticed something odd. Off in the distance, barely visible through the trees, was a faint light. At first, I thought it must be another camper's fire, but it didn't flicker or move like flames. It was steady, almost like a flashlight or a lantern. I shrugged it off, figuring it was probably just some hikers making their way through the forest. It was far enough away that I wasn't concerned about my solitude being disturbed. Besides, there was something comforting about knowing there were other people out there, even if I couldn't see or hear them. The next day passed uneventfully. I spent my time exploring the area around my camp, taking notes for my writing, and simply enjoying the quiet beauty of the forest. As night fell, I once again settled in by my fire. That's when I saw the light again. This time it seemed closer. Not dramatically so, but enough that I could tell it had moved. I peered into the darkness, trying to make out any details, but all I could see was that unwavering point of light through the trees. A chill ran down my spine, though I couldn't quite say why. There was something unsettling about that steady glow, something that didn't feel quite natural. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting my writer's imagination run wild. Probably just some park rangers doing a night patrol, I reasoned. Nothing to worry about. But as I lay in my tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig made me start. I dozed fitfully, my dreams filled with shapeless fears and that persistent, watching light. The third day dawned bright and clear, and in the cheerful morning sunlight, my fears seemed silly. I spent the day hiking, pushing myself further into the wilderness. The physical exertion and the beauty around me drove all thoughts of mysterious lights from my mind. As evening approached, I made my way back to my campsite, pleasantly tired and looking forward to a quiet night by the fire. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, my earlier unease returned. I found myself glancing constantly toward where I'd seen the light the previous nights. As full darkness fell, I held my breath, both dreading and expecting to see that glow once again. There it was. My heart sank as I spotted it, and this time there was no doubt. It was definitely closer, close enough that I could now tell it wasn't just a single point of light, but a cluster of them, moving together in a way that reminded me unsettlingly of eyes. I stood up, peering into the darkness, trying to see what was behind those lights. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and afraid in the vast silence of the forest. "Is someone there?" No response came, just that steady, unwavering glow, watching me from the shadows between the trees. A gust of wind rustled through the leaves, and I could have sworn I heard something else. A whisper, just on the edge of hearing. I strained my ears, but couldn't make out any words, if indeed there were any. Sleep was almost impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those lights burned into my eyelids. I tossed and turned, alternating between convincing myself it was nothing to worry about and imagining increasingly terrifying explanations. By the fourth night, I was a nervous wreck. I'd spent the day debating whether to pack up and leave, but something kept me there. Curiosity, stubbornness, or maybe just paralyzing fear. I couldn't say for sure. As darkness fell, I didn't even pretend to go about my usual evening routine. I stood at the edge of my campsite, eyes fixed on the spot where I knew the lights would appear. And appear they did, earlier than before, and so much closer that I had to stifle a scream. They were at the edge of the clearing now, no more than 50 feet away. I could see them clearly. 3 distinct points of light, glowing with an eerie, pale blue radiance. They hovered about 6 feet off the ground, arranged in a triangle pattern that looked disturbingly like a face. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "What do you want?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a sound began to build, a low hum that I felt more than heard, vibrating in my chest and making my teeth ache. The lights pulsed in time with the sound, growing brighter and dimmer in a hypnotic rhythm. I wanted to run, to flee into the darkness of the forest, but I was rooted to the spot. My whole body trembled as the humming grew louder, the lights brighter. The air around me felt thick, charged with some kind of energy I couldn't understand. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The forest plunged into silence so absolute it was almost painful. The lights dimmed but didn't go out, still watching me with that unblinking, triangular gaze. A voice spoke then, but it wasn't a voice like anything I'd ever heard before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating in my mind rather than my ears. "We have been watching you," it said, each word sending shivers through my body. "We have been waiting." What are you?" I managed to stammer out. "We are not for you to understand," the voice replied. "We are beyond your comprehension, but you, we understand all too well." As it spoke, images began to flash through my mind, memories of my life, but seen from an outside perspective. I saw myself as a child, as a teenager, as an adult. I saw my hopes, my fears, my deepest secrets laid bare. "Stop it!" I cried out, clutching my head as if I could physically push the invasive thoughts away. "Get out of my mind!" "We cannot stop," the voice said, implacable and emotionless. "We must know. We must understand." The assault on my mind continued, memories and thoughts whirling past faster than I could process. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the psychic invasion. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "What do you want from me?" There was a pause, and for a moment the mental onslaught ceased. When the voice spoke again, it seemed almost curious. "Want? We do not want. We simply are. And now, you are part of us." The lights began to move then, drifting towards me with agonizing slowness. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch in helpless terror as they drew nearer. Just as the lights were about to reach me, a new sound cut through the night. The distant whop-whop-whop of helicopter blades. The lights froze, then began to retreat rapidly. "We will return," the voice said, fading along with the lights. "You cannot escape us. You are ours now." As the lights disappeared into the forest, I finally found the strength to move. I scrambled to my feet and ran, leaving everything behind in my blind panic. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing onto the forest floor as the sound of the helicopter grew louder. The next thing I remember clearly is being in a hospital bed, surrounded by concerned doctors and stern-faced government agents. They told me I'd been found wandering in the forest, dehydrated and babbling about lights and voices. They asked me countless questions, but I could tell they didn't believe my answers. How could they? I barely believed it myself. It's been months now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, certain that I can see those lights watching me from the corners of my room. The doctors say it's just trauma, that with time and therapy I'll recover. But I know the truth. I know they're still out there, whatever they are. And I know that one day they'll come back for me. Because like they said, I'm theirs now. And somehow, I don't think they're the kind to let go of what they claim. So I watch the night sky with wary eyes, jumping at every unexplained light. And I wonder, not for the first time, if there are some parts of the wilderness that are better left unexplored. The first gunshot shattered the peaceful night, and in that moment, I realized our camping trip had become a desperate fight for survival. We weren't just lost in the wilderness anymore. We were being hunted. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. My three closest friends, Mike and Sarah and Alex and I, had been planning this camping trip for months. We were all experienced hikers, but this was our first time venturing into the more remote areas of the national forest. The promise of untouched wilderness and breathtaking views had been too tempting to resist. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for. We hiked through dense forests, crossed crystal-clear streams, and set up camp each night under a canopy of stars so bright it seemed unreal. On the third day, we decided to go off-trail, seeking out a hidden waterfall we'd heard about from a local guide. In hindsight, that was our first mistake. By mid-afternoon, it became clear we were lost. The terrain was rougher than we'd anticipated, and the landmarks didn't match up with our map. As the sun began to set, a tense silence fell over our group. We needed to find a place to camp for the night and reorient ourselves in the morning. We finally found a small clearing as the last light was fading from the sky. As we set up our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed too quiet, the shadows too deep. "Hey, does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Sarah asked, voicing the unease we all felt. Mike laughed, but it sounded forced. "It's just the woods playing tricks on us. We're all a bit on edge from being lost." We tried to lighten the mood, sharing stories around the campfire and making plans for getting back on track the next day. But as we retreated to our tents, that sense of wrongness lingered. I was jolted awake by the sound of a twig snapping nearby. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, too heavy to be an animal. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and peered out. The moon was bright enough to cast long shadows across our campsite. At first, I saw nothing. Then a movement caught my eye. A figure was moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing, then another, and another. My heart began to race as I realized we were surrounded. I hissed at my friends to wake up, trying to keep my voice low. As they groggily emerged from their tents, I saw the moment realization dawned on their faces. "Who are they?" Alex whispered, his voice tight with fear. Before anyone could answer, a voice rang out from the darkness. "We know you're awake in there. Come on out, nice and easy." We exchanged terrified glances. There was no way to run. We were surrounded, and they had the advantage of knowing the terrain. Slowly, we emerged from our tents, hands raised. In the moonlight, I could see our captors clearly now. There were 5 of them, all men, dressed in camouflage and carrying rifles. They didn't look like park rangers or any official authority. The way they held their weapons with casual familiarity sent a chill down my spine. One of the men, a tall, bearded guy who seemed to be the leader, stepped forward. Well, what do we have here? A bunch of city folk out for a nature walk." "We're just camping," Mike said, his voice surprisingly steady. "We got a bit lost, that's all. If this is private property, we'll leave right away." The leader chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, it ain't about private property, boy. You see, you've wandered into our hunting grounds, and tonight, you're the game." My blood ran cold as his words sank in. These weren't just poachers. They were something far worse. "You can't be serious," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We're people, not animals. You can't hunt us." "Can't we?" the leader replied, raising his rifle. "Way I see it, you're trespassing. And out here, we make our own rules." Time seemed to stand still as we stood there, the barrel of his gun glinting in the moonlight. Then, in a burst of desperate courage, Alex made a run for it. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the quiet forest. Alex cried out and stumbled, clutching his arm, but kept running. In that moment of chaos, instinct took over. We scattered, each of us sprinting in a different direction into the dark woods. I ran blindly, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear shouts behind me, then another gunshot. I ran faster, my lungs burning, driven by pure terror. I don't know how long I ran before I finally stopped, collapsing behind a large fallen tree. My whole body shook as I tried to catch my breath, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. Then, in the distance, I heard a scream. It was Sarah's voice, cut off abruptly. Tears sprang to my eyes as I imagined what might have happened to her. I wanted to go back, to try and help my friends, but I knew it would be suicide. I was unarmed, lost, and alone against multiple armed men who knew these woods far better than I did. My only hope was to somehow make it back to civilization and get help. As the adrenaline faded, I became aware of a sharp pain in my side. Looking down, I saw my shirt was torn and stained with blood. I must have caught it on a branch while running. It didn't seem too deep, but in these conditions, even a small wound could become dangerous. I allowed myself a few more moments to rest, then forced myself to my feet. I had to keep moving. Standing still meant certain death. The next few hours were a nightmare of constant movement and paralyzing fear. Every snapping twig made me freeze. Every distant shout sent me scrambling for cover. I tried to move in what I thought was the direction of the main trail, but in the darkness, it was impossible to be sure. As dawn began to break, I heard voices again, closer this time. I ducked behind a large rock, hardly daring to breathe. 2 of the hunters passed by, so close I could have reached out and touched them. "They can't have gotten far," one of them was saying. "The girl's down, and we winged one of the guys. They'll be slowing down soon." "Boss wants them all by sundown," the other replied. "Says we can't risk them getting back to the Rangers." As their voices faded, I felt a glimmer of hope. If they were worried about us reaching the Rangers, it meant we must be closer to the edge of their territory than I'd thought. With renewed determination, I pressed on. The rising sun made it easier to navigate, and I began to recognize landmarks from our hike in. But my optimism was short-lived. As I crested a small hill, I saw 2 figures in the valley below. My heart leapt. It was Mike and Alex. Alex was leaning heavily on Mike, his arm crudely bandaged. They were alive. I was about to call out to them when a movement in the trees caught my eye. One of the hunters was there, rifle raised, taking aim at my friends. Without thinking, I grabbed the largest rock I could find and hurled it at the hunter. It struck him in the back, throwing off his aim. The rifle discharged into the air. Mike and Alex's heads snapped up at the sound. "Run!" I screamed, already sprinting down the hill towards them. What followed was a desperate chase through the forest. We supported Alex between us, trying to move as fast as we could while staying low and using the trees for cover. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, punctuated by the occasional crack of gunfire. Just when I thought we couldn't go on, the trees began to thin, and then, miraculously, we burst out onto a paved road. A park ranger's truck was parked there, the ranger himself looking startled at our sudden appearance. "Help!" I gasped, stumbling towards him. "Please, you have to help us. They're right behind us." The ranger took one look at our battered, terrified state and Alex's bleeding arm, and quickly ushered us into his truck. As we sped away, I saw movement at the tree line, our pursuers, forced to retreat back into their forest. The following days were a blur of hospital visits, police interviews, and search parties. They never found Sarah, or any trace of the men who had hunted us. The official report cited an unfortunate encounter with illegal hunters, but we knew the truth was far darker. It's been months now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, the sound of gunshots echoing in my dreams. I haven't set foot in a forest since that day, and I'm not sure I ever will again. Because now I know that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the wilderness walk on 2 legs, and the most terrifying hunts are those where humans are the prey. The moment I saw his eyes in the flickering firelight, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The stranger I'd invited into my tent wasn't seeking shelter from the storm. He was bringing a tempest of his own. I've always been a solitary camper. There's something about the quiet of the woods, the solitude of being alone with nature, that speaks to my soul. So when I planned a week-long camping trip in the Ozark Mountains, going solo felt natural. I'd done my research, packed my gear meticulously, and set out with a spring in my step and adventure in my heart. The first few days were blissful. I hiked through dense forests, marveling at the autumn colors painting the landscape. My evenings were spent by a crackling campfire, listening to the night sounds of the forest and gazing at stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. I felt at peace, more connected to the world around me than I had in years. On the fourth day, the weather began to turn. Dark clouds rolled in, bringing with them a biting wind that cut through my layers. I set up camp earlier than usual, choosing a spot sheltered by a rocky overhang. As I secured my tent, the first fat raindrops began to fall. By nightfall, the storm was raging in earnest. Rain lashed against my tent, driven by howling winds that bent the trees and sent fallen leaves swirling through the air. Thunder boomed overhead, so close it made the ground tremble. I huddled in my sleeping bag, grateful for the protection of my sturdy tent, and tried to convince myself that the weather would pass by morning. That's when I heard it, a voice, barely audible over the storm, calling out for help. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, a trick of the wind. But then it came again, louder this time. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, I need help." I hesitated. Every instinct honed by years of solo camping told me to stay put, to not risk exposing myself to the storm or to a potential threat. But the voice sounded genuinely distressed, and I couldn't bear the thought of someone being stranded out there in this weather. Pulling on my rain gear, I unzipped the tent and peered out into the darkness. Lightning flashed, illuminating a figure stumbling through the trees. It was a man, soaked to the skin and shivering violently. "Over here," I called out, waving my flashlight. "This way." He made his way towards me, relief evident in his posture. As he got closer, I could see he was probably in his mid-40s, with a scruffy beard and clothes that had seen better days even before the soaking. "Thank God," he gasped as he reached me. "I thought I was done for out there. My tent got blown away, and I've been wandering for hours." I ushered him into the shelter of my tent, handing him a towel and my spare set of dry clothes. "I'm Eric," I said, trying to sound calm and friendly despite the unease gnawing at my gut. "What's your name?" "Mike," he replied, teeth chattering as he dried off. "I can't thank you enough for this. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found your camp." As Mike changed into the dry clothes, I fired up my camp stove to make some hot tea. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the tent, it felt almost cozy. I told myself I'd done the right thing. How would I have felt if I'd ignored his cries for help and found out later that something had happened to him? But as we sat there, sipping tea and waiting out the storm, I began to notice things that set my nerves on edge. Mike's eyes darted around constantly, never settling on one spot for long. His hands shook, and not just from the cold. And the way he spoke, rapid-fire sentences punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences, made me wonder if he was entirely stable. "So, Mike," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "where are you from? What brings you out camping in weather like this?" His eyes snapped to mine, and for a moment, I saw something there that made my blood run cold. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, just needed to get away for a while," he said vaguely. "Clear my head. You know how it is." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The uneasy feeling in my stomach had grown into full-blown anxiety. I found myself acutely aware of how isolated we were, how far from help if anything went wrong. As the night wore on, Mike's behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd swing between manic chattiness and brooding silence. Several times, I caught him staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You're a nice guy, Eric," he said suddenly, breaking a long silence. "Not many people would help a stranger like this. Most people are selfish. Cruel." There was a bitterness in his voice that set alarm bells ringing in my head. I mumbled some non-committal response, my mind racing to figure out how to get out of this situation. "Have you ever thought about how easy it would be to just disappear out here?" Mike continued, his voice taking on a dreamy quality that was somehow more terrifying than anger. "No one would know. No one would care." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he must be able to hear it. I tried to keep my voice steady as I replied, I'm sure people would care, Mike. Everyone has someone who'd miss them. He laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that made me flinch. Not everyone, Eric. Not me. No one's looking for me. No one cares where I am or what I do. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was in danger. This man wasn't just a lost hiker, he was unstable, possibly dangerous, and I was trapped in a small tent with him miles from anywhere. I stood up, trying to appear casual. "I'm just going to step outside for a moment," I said, reaching for the tent zipper. "Nature calls, you know." Mike's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Don't try to leave me. I can't be alone again. I won't." Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other, the only sound the pounding of the rain on the tent and my own thundering heartbeat. I knew I had to act, and act now. With my free hand, I grabbed the lantern and swung it at Mike's head. It connected with a sickening thud, and his grip on my wrist loosened. I didn't wait to see if he was knocked out. I unzipped the tent and ran. The storm hit me like a physical force as I burst out of the tent. Rain lashed at my face, nearly blinding me, and the wind threatened to knock me off my feet. But fear drove me forward. I ran without direction, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and Mike as possible. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in the chaos of the storm. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Every sound behind me became Mike in pursuit. Every shadow his reaching hands. Finally, my foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, tumbling down a steep embankment. I lay there at the bottom, the breath knocked out of me, certain that at any moment I'd feel Mike's grasp. But as the minutes ticked by and nothing happened, I began to hope. Had I lost him? Or had he not followed at all? Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself to my feet. The storm was beginning to ease, the first hints of dawn lightening the sky. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I was standing on a trail, a real, maintained hiking trail. Relief washed over me so strongly my knees nearly buckled. I wasn't lost. I could follow this trail back to civilization, to safety. I started walking, each step taking me further from the nightmare of the night before. As the sun rose, I emerged from the forest into a parking lot. A park ranger was just getting out of his truck, looking surprised to see a bedraggled hiker appear at dawn. I told him everything, watching his face grow grave as he called it in. They never found Mike, or any trace of him. My campsite was empty when they checked, my gear gone. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the solitude and the storm played tricks on my mind. But then I remember the look in Mike's eyes, the grip on my wrist, and I know it was all too real. I haven't been camping since that night. The peace I once found in solitude has been replaced by a wariness, a knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous things in the wilderness aren't the animals or the elements, but the darkness that can lurk in the human heart. I know I'll camp again someday. I won't let one bad experience ruin my love for nature, but I'll never again open my tent to a stranger on a stormy night. Some risks aren't worth taking, no matter how well-intentioned you might be. The moment I heard them mention the witness, I knew I was in far deeper trouble than I'd ever imagined. What had started as a simple hike had turned into a fight for survival, with me caught in the middle of something I couldn't even begin to understand. I've always been drawn to the solitude of nature. There's something about being alone in the wilderness that clears my mind and rejuvenates my soul. So when I decided to take a week-long solo hiking trip in the backcountry of Utah, I was ecstatic. I'd researched the area thoroughly, packed all the necessary gear, and set out with a spring in my step and adventure in my heart. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. I trekked through stunning red rock canyons, marveled at ancient petroglyphs, and slept under a canopy of stars so bright it seemed unreal. I felt more alive than I had in years. my worries and stress melting away with each mile I covered. On the fourth day, I decided to explore a less traveled path that promised breathtaking views of a hidden valley. The trail was rough and overgrown, clearly not maintained like the main routes, but that only added to the sense of adventure. I felt like a true explorer, venturing into territory few had seen. As the sun began to set, I started looking for a suitable campsite. That's when I saw it, a small cabin tucked away in a grove of juniper trees. It looked old and weathered, but still sturdy. Curious, I approached, wondering if it was an old ranger station or perhaps a long-abandoned homestead. The door creaked as I pushed it open, dust motes dancing in the fading sunlight that streamed through the grimy windows. The interior was sparse, a small wood stove, a rickety table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot pushed against one wall. But what caught my eye were the food wrappers scattered on the table. Recent food wrappers. My heart began to race. Someone had been here, and recently, I knew I should leave, head back to my original trail and find a different campsite. But curiosity got the better of me. I stepped further into the cabin, my eyes darting around for any other signs of recent habitation. That's when I heard the voices. They were faint at first, barely audible over the evening breeze. But they were getting closer. Panic seized me as I realized I was trapped. There was nowhere to run. The cabin was the only structure for miles. And in the open desert, I'd be spotted immediately if I tried to flee. Desperate, I looked for a hiding spot. The space under the cot was too exposed, and there was no closet or other furniture to conceal myself. Then I spotted it, a small trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden by a threadbare rug. With shaking hands, I pulled it open and lowered myself into the dark space below. It was tight and musty, filled with cobwebs and the scurrying sounds of small creatures. I pulled the trapdoor closed just as I heard boots on the cabin's porch. The door swung open, and heavy footsteps entered the cabin. I held my breath, pressing myself into the farthest corner of my hiding spot. "Damn, I'm beat," a gruff voice said. "Pass me a beer, would you?" "Sure thing, boss," another voice replied. I heard the clink of bottles and the hiss of caps being removed. "So, what's the plan?" a third voice asked. "We can't stay here much longer. The cops are going to start sniffing around soon." "Relax," the first voice, the boss, said. "I've got it all figured out. We lay low here for another day or two, then make our way to the rendezvous point. Our contact will have new IDs and transportation waiting." My mind was reeling. Who were these men? What had they done that had them hiding from the police? I wanted nothing more than to crawl out of my hiding spot and run as far and fast as I could. But I was trapped, forced to listen as they continued their conversation. "What about the witness?" the second voice asked. "You sure they can't ID us?" My blood ran cold. Witness? Had these men committed a crime so serious that they were worried about witnesses? "Nah, we're good," the boss replied. "They didn't get a clear look at us. Besides, by the time they piece everything together, we'll be long gone." They continued to talk, their voices growing louder and more animated as they drank. I caught bits and pieces of their conversation, something about a job gone wrong, a security guard who wasn't supposed to be there, a getaway that nearly went sideways. Hours passed, though it felt like an eternity. My muscles cramped from holding still for so long, and I had to fight the urge to cough as dust tickled my nose. Finally, mercifully, the men decided to turn in for the night. "I'll take first watch," the boss said. "You two get some sleep. We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow." I heard the creak of the cot as someone lay down, and the scrape of chair legs as the others settled in. The cabin fell silent except for the occasional snore and the sound of bottles being emptied. I knew this might be my only chance. Moving as slowly and quietly as I could, I eased the trapdoor open just a crack. Through the slim opening, I could see the boss sitting at the table, his back to me. The other two were asleep, one on the cot, the other slumped in a chair. My heart pounding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. I began to lift the trapdoor further, just a few more inches, and I might be able to slip out. A floorboard creaked under my hand. The boss whirled around, his eyes widening as they locked with mine. For a split second, we both froze, equally shocked. Then he shouted, "We've got company!" I burst from my hiding spot, adrenaline giving me strength I didn't know I possessed. I shoved past the boss, knocking him off balance, and made a mad dash for the door. The other two men were awake now, scrambling to their feet in confusion. I hit the door at full speed, nearly ripping it off its hinges as I exploded out into the night. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the pounding of feet as the men gave chase, but fear lent wings to my feet, and I ran like I'd never run before. The desert night was pitch black, the moon hidden behind clouds. I stumbled over rocks and crashed through scrub brush, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to get away. A gunshot rang out, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. I ducked instinctively, though I had no idea if the shot was aimed at me or just a warning. Either way, it spurred me to run faster. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in the terrifying flight. Eventually, I became aware that I could no longer hear pursuit behind me. I slowed to a stop, my legs trembling with exhaustion, and listened intently. Nothing but the whisper of wind through the junipers and the pounding of my own heart. As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of my situation set in. I was lost in the Utah desert in the middle of the night, with no supplies and no idea which direction would lead me to safety. And somewhere out there, 3 dangerous men were looking for me. I knew I couldn't stay put. Once the sun rose, I'd be exposed and easy to spot in the open desert. I had to keep moving, try to find my way back to a marked trail or a road. Picking a direction that I hoped would lead me away from the cabin, I set off at a brisk walk. The night seemed endless, each shadow a potential threat, each sound a possible pursuer. But as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I saw something that made my heart leap. A paved road cutting through the desert. Summoning the last of my strength, I jogged towards it. Just as I reached the asphalt, I heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, the rumble of an approaching vehicle. I turned to see a park ranger's truck coming around a bend. I flagged it down frantically, relief washing over me as it slowed to a stop. The ranger looked alarmed as he took in my disheveled appearance and wild eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked, reaching for his radio. What happened? The whole story came pouring out of me in a rush. To his credit, the ranger listened without interruption, his face growing grave as I described the men at the cabin and what I'd overheard. "You did the right thing by running," he said when I'd finished. "We've had reports of some dangerous fugitives in the area. You're lucky you got away." He called for backup and an ambulance to check me over, assuring me that they'd search for the men. As we waited, the sun rose fully, bathing the desert in golden light. It was beautiful, but I could no longer see it the same way. The wilderness I'd loved for its solitude now seemed full of hidden dangers. I never did find out who those men were or what exactly they'd done. The cabin was empty when the rangers searched it, with only my account as evidence that anyone had been there at all. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the isolation and the desert heat had played tricks on my mind. But then I remember the terror of that night, the sound of that gunshot echoing off the canyon walls, and I know it was all too real. I still go hiking, still seek out the peace of nature, but I'm more cautious now, more aware that even in the most remote places, you're never truly alone. And sometimes, the most dangerous things in the wilderness walk on 2 legs. The first time I saw the truck, I thought nothing of it. By the 3rd time, I knew I was being followed. What I didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary road trip was about to turn into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. I've always loved road trips. There's something freeing about being on the open road, watching the landscape change as you cross state lines, stopping at quirky roadside attractions, and meeting interesting people along the way. So when I decided to take a solo cross-country drive from New York to California, I was excited about the adventure ahead. I spent weeks planning my route, marking points of interest and scheduling stops at national parks along the way. I packed my trusty sedan with camping gear, snacks, and a well-stocked emergency kit. On a crisp autumn morning, I set out, the rising sun at my back and the promise of adventure on the horizon. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. I sang along to my favorite playlists, stopped to take photos of stunning vistas, and enjoyed the solitude of the open road. Each night, I'd either camp under the stars or crash at a small motel, falling asleep with a contented smile on my face. It was on the fourth day, somewhere in the vast expanse of the Midwest, that I first noticed the truck. It was a large, dark blue semi with no distinguishing features or company logos. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, truckers and road trippers often follow similar routes for long stretches. But as the day wore on, I began to feel uneasy. Every time I stopped, for gas, for food, for a quick stretch, the truck would appear shortly after, pulling into the same rest stop or parking lot. It always kept its distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the driver was just on a similar schedule. Maybe I was being paranoid, the long hours on the road playing tricks on my mind. But as I settled into my motel room that night, I made sure to double-check the locks on my door and windows. The next morning, I hit the road early, hoping to shake off my unease with the rising sun. For a few hours, I saw no sign of the blue truck, and I began to relax. I even laughed at myself for being so jumpy. But as I pulled into a small town for lunch, my heart sank. There it was, parked across the street from the diner where I'd stopped. I ate quickly, my appetite gone, constantly glancing out the window. The truck didn't move, but I never saw the driver. As I left, I made a spontaneous decision to deviate from my planned route. Instead of heading west as I'd intended, I turned south, taking a series of small back roads. For a while, I thought I'd lost them. The narrow country lanes were empty save for the occasional farmer's pickup or local traffic. I began to breathe easier, enjoying the scenic detour despite the circumstances that had prompted it. But as afternoon faded into evening and I merged back onto a larger highway, my blood ran cold. There it was again, the blue truck, looming in my rearview mirror. Panic set in. This was no coincidence. Whoever was driving that truck was following me, had perhaps been following me for days. But why? I racked my brain, trying to think if I'd witnessed something I shouldn't have, if I'd somehow offended someone along the way. Nothing came to mind. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my car faster than I'd ever driven before. The truck kept pace effortlessly, always maintaining the same distance behind me. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I looked for an exit, any exit. Finally, I saw a sign for a small town coming up. Without signaling, I swerved onto the exit ramp at the last second. In my mirror, I saw the truck continue past. Had I lost them? I pulled into the first motel I saw, a rundown place that had seen better days. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely sign the register. I took a room on the second floor, facing away from the road. Sleep was impossible. Every sound, a door closing, a car passing, made me jump. I sat by the window, peering out through a crack in the curtains, watching for any sign of the blue truck. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I couldn't keep running blindly. I needed help. With trembling fingers, I dialed the local police station. The officer who answered sounded skeptical as I poured out my story. I realized how crazy it all sounded. A mysterious truck following me across multiple states. Always there, but never quite close enough to confront. He promised to send a patrol car by the motel, but advised me that without any concrete evidence of a threat, there wasn't much they could do. I hung up feeling frustrated and more alone than ever. I was considering my options when I heard it, the unmistakable rumble of a large truck engine, my heart in my throat. I peeked out the window. There it was, the blue truck, idling in the motel parking lot. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but to my horror, there was no signal. In my panic the night before, I hadn't noticed that my cell service was out in this rural area. I was trapped. A knock at the door made me nearly jump out of my skin. "Housekeeping," a female voice called. Relief washed over me. Another person, someone who could help, or at least witness what was happening. I opened the door. My relief turned to ice in my veins. It wasn't housekeeping. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with cold eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Hello," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "I think it's time we had a chat." I tried to slam the door, but he was too quick, too strong. He pushed his way in, closing the door behind him with a quiet click that seemed to seal my fate. "Please," I stammered, backing away until I hit the far wall. "I don't know what you want, but I haven't done anything. I haven't seen anything. Just let me go, and I swear I won't say a word to anyone." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, you have something that belongs to us, something very valuable." My mind raced. What could I possibly have that would be worth following me across half the country? I'd been careful with my belongings, hadn't picked up any hitchhikers or strange packages. As if reading my thoughts, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a photo. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized it, a picture of me at a gas station on the first day of my trip. In the background, barely visible, was a man handing something to another person behind a car. "You didn't see it at the time," the man said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "But your camera did. That little automatic upload feature on your phone is quite handy, isn't it? Uploads every photo you take to the cloud, where anyone with the right skills can find it." I remembered the moment now. I'd been taking a selfie in front of a funny road sign, not paying attention to anything else around me. I hadn't even noticed the men in the background. "I don't understand," I said, my voice shaking. "What does this have to do with me? I didn't see anything." "Intent doesn't matter," he replied. "What matters is that you have evidence of a very important transaction. Evidence that could cause a lot of problems for some very powerful people." He stepped closer, and I pressed myself harder against the wall, wishing I could melt through it. "Now, we could just take your phone, delete the photos. But how can we be sure you haven't seen them? Haven't figured out what they mean?" "No. I'm afraid this needs a more permanent solution." My eyes darted to the door, gauging the distance. Could I make it? As if sensing my thoughts, he moved to block my path. "Don't do anything foolish," he said, reaching into his jacket. I tensed, expecting a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small black device. "This will fry every electronic device in the room. Your phone, your laptop, everything. All your photos, all your data, gone. After that, well, let's just say you're going to have a very unfortunate accident. Tragic, really. A young traveler all alone, no one to miss them for days." As he fiddled with the device, time seemed to slow down. I saw my life flash before my eyes. My family, my friends, all the places I'd still wanted to see. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I lunged forward, catching him off guard. The device fell from his hands as I shoved past him, my fingers scrambling for the door handle. I yanked it open and ran, not daring to look back. I took the stairs 2 at a time, bursting out into the parking lot. The blue truck was still there, its engine running. Without thinking, I ran towards it, yanking open the passenger door and climbing in. The driver, a younger man with a startled expression, stared at me in shock. "Drive!" I yelled, my voice high with panic. "Please, just drive!" Maybe it was the wild look in my eyes, or maybe he was just caught off guard, but he listened. The truck lurched forward just as I saw the other man emerge from my motel room. As we pulled onto the highway, I finally let myself breathe. The driver kept glancing at me nervously, clearly unsure what to make of the situation. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know this is crazy, but that man back there, He was going to kill me. All because of a photo I accidentally took. Please, I just need to get to a police station. Something in my voice must have convinced him. He nodded, his expression softening. There's one in the next town, about 20 miles from here. I'll take you there. True to his word, he dropped me off at the police station. As I watched him drive away, I realized I'd never even asked his name. My guardian angel in a blue semi-truck. The police were skeptical at first, but the wild story combined with my obvious terror convinced them to investigate. They found evidence of the man's presence in my motel room, and my photo, the one that started it all, turned out to be key evidence in breaking open a major drug trafficking ring. I spent weeks helping the police and FBI, going over every detail of my trip. In the end, several arrests were made, including some high-ranking officials who had been protecting the operation. It's been years now, but I still get nervous every time I see a blue truck on the highway. My carefree love of road trips has been replaced by a cautious vigilance. I'm more careful about the photos I take, more aware of my surroundings, but I haven't stopped traveling. I refuse to let fear rule my life. Instead, I've learned to balance caution with curiosity, always remembering that sometimes the most ordinary moments can lead to the most extraordinary stories. And sometimes, the very thing that puts you in danger can also be your salvation. The moment I saw the first symbol carved into the tree, I felt a chill run down my spine. By the time I noticed the third one, I knew I wasn't alone in these woods, and whatever was out there with me was far from friendly. I've always been drawn to the less traveled paths, the hidden corners of the world that most people overlook. That's what led me to rent a small, isolated cabin deep in the forests of northern Maine. I was working on my novel, and I figured a month away from the distractions of civilization was just what I needed to finally finish it. The cabin was everything I'd hoped for: rustic, cozy, and completely off the grid. No electricity, no running water, just me, my laptop, with a solar charger, and the vast wilderness surrounding me. The first few days were bliss. I'd wake up with the sun, spend my mornings writing on the small porch, and use the afternoons to explore the surrounding woods. It was on one of these afternoon hikes, about a week into my stay, that I first noticed something odd. I was following a barely there trail, pushing through dense underbrush, when I came across a tree with a strange symbol carved into its bark. It looked ancient, the edges of the carving weathered and grown over, but the symbol itself was clear, a circle with a jagged line through it, almost like a stylized lightning bolt. I brushed it off as an old trail marker, maybe something left by loggers or earlier settlers. But as I continued my hike, I saw another one, then another. Each symbol was slightly different, but they all shared that same basic circular shape. By the time I returned to the cabin, I'd counted 7 of them. That night, as I sat by the fireplace working on my novel, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling those symbols had given me. I tried to rationalize it. I was alone in the woods. My writer's imagination was probably just working overtime. But every creak of the cabin's old timbers, every rustle of wind through the trees outside, set my nerves on edge. The next morning, I woke to find a new symbol carved into the trunk of a tree right at the edge of the clearing where my cabin sat. My blood ran cold. This carving was fresh, the wood still pale where the bark had been stripped away. Someone had been here, right outside my cabin, while I slept. I spent the day inside, jumping at every sound, peering out the windows for any sign of movement. As dusk fell, I heard it, a low, rhythmic chanting coming from the woods. It was too faint to make out any words, but the sound sent shivers down my spine. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, though I knew they'd be little protection if whoever was out there really wanted to get in. The chanting continued through the night, rising and falling like the tide. I didn't sleep a wink, just sat in a chair facing the door, a heavy flashlight clutched in my hand like a weapon. When dawn finally broke, The chanting stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Exhausted and on edge, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to pack up and leave. Novel be damned. But as I stepped outside to load up my car, my heart sank. Another symbol had been carved into the cabin's front door, this one larger and more intricate than the others. I threw my bags into the car and fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, but wouldn't catch. I popped the hood, though I know next to nothing about cars. What I saw made my blood run cold. The battery was gone. Not dead, not disconnected, but completely removed. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. The nearest town was a good 30 miles away, through dense forest. Even if I could make the hike, I had no guarantee that whoever had taken my battery wouldn't follow me. I barricaded myself in the cabin, pushing the heavy wooden table in front of the door. As the day wore on, I noticed more symbols appearing on the trees surrounding the clearing, each one seeming to draw the circle tighter around me. The chanting started again as night fell, louder this time, close enough that I could almost make out words in a language I didn't recognize. I cowered in the center of the cabin, away from the windows, my eyes darting from door to door. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rough-hewn walls and the shadows that seemed to dance in the corners. Every creak, every groan of the old structure sounded like footsteps, like someone, or something, trying to get in. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I must have dozed off despite my terror. I woke with a start to silence. The chanting had stopped. Pale dawn light filtered through the windows, and for a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it had all been a terrible dream, a product of isolation and an overactive imagination. But when I looked down, that hope shattered. There, on the wooden floor all around me, were more symbols. Dozens of them, burnt into the wood as if by a hot brand, forming a complex pattern with me at the center. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in short gasps. They had been in here. While I slept, they had been right here with me. I ran to the door, shoving the table aside with strength born of sheer panic. I had to get out, had to run, even if I had no idea where I was going. But as I yanked the door open, I froze. Standing in a semicircle around the cabin were figures in dark robes, their faces hidden by deep hoods. They stood perfectly still, silent, waiting. In the center was a taller figure, holding a staff carved with the same symbols I'd seen on the trees. The leader stepped forward, raising a hand in what might have been meant as a calming gesture. "We've been waiting for you," a voice said from within the hood, neither male nor female, but somehow both and neither at once. "You have been chosen." Chosen for what? I managed to croak out, my voice hoarse with fear. "To join us, to become part of something greater than yourself. The signs have been clear. Your arrival here was no accident." As the figure spoke, the others began to chant again, the same rhythmic sounds I'd heard through the night. I felt a strange pull, an urge to step forward and join them. It took every ounce of willpower I had to resist. "I don't understand," I said, gripping the doorframe to keep myself from moving closer. "What are you? What do you want from me?" The leader tilted their head, and though I couldn't see their face, I had the distinct impression they were smiling. "We are the guardians of ancient knowledge, keepers of secrets long forgotten by the world of men. And you, my dear, have a role to play in the grand design." As they spoke, the chanting grew louder, more insistent. The symbols on the ground began to glow with an eerie light. I felt dizzy, my thoughts becoming fuzzy. Part of me wanted to give in, to let go and join whatever this was. But another part, the part that had always pushed me to explore, to question, to seek the truth, rebelled against the idea. In that moment of internal struggle, I made a decision. I ran. Not towards the robed figures, but back into the cabin. I slammed the door shut and grabbed my backpack, shoving in whatever supplies I could reach. Then I ran for the back door, praying it wasn't guarded. To my relief, the back of the cabin was clear. I sprinted into the woods, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. The chanting had turned angry, threatening. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. When I couldn't run anymore, I found a dense thicket and crawled inside, making myself as small as possible. I lay there, barely breathing, listening to the sounds of my pursuers growing fainter. I don't know how long I stayed hidden. Hours, maybe. When I finally dared to move, the forest was quiet, save for the normal sounds of birds and small animals. Cautiously, I made my way back to the main trail, then followed it to the ranger station I'd passed on my way in. The rangers were skeptical of my story, of course. They found no trace of the robed figures, no strange symbols carved into trees. Even the cabin, when they checked it, was undisturbed. If it hadn't been for the new symbols I'd found branded into my own skin, small ones on the inside of my wrists, I might have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. I've spent years trying to understand what happened to me in those woods. I've researched obscure cults, ancient symbols, forgotten religions. I've never found any conclusive answers, but I've never stopped looking, because I know, deep down, that what I experienced was real. And I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, they'll come for me again. Every now and then, I see a symbol out of the corner of my eye, carved into a tree in a city park, drawn in chalk on a sidewalk. And I wonder if I ever really escaped at all, or if I'm still playing a part in their grand design, even now. The first symbol appeared on the old oak tree nearest to my cabin. By the third night, they had encircled my temporary home, and the whispers in the dark grew louder. I knew then that my peaceful writing retreat had become a waking nightmare. I'd always dreamed of writing a novel, but the chaos of city life and a demanding job left little time for creativity. So when I stumbled upon an ad for a secluded cabin rental deep in the Appalachian Mountains, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. A month alone in the wilderness. Just me, my laptop, and the great outdoors. What could go wrong? The drive up was breathtaking. As I wound my way along narrow mountain roads, the world seemed to fall away, replaced by towering trees and misty valleys. The cabin itself was everything I'd hoped for, rustic, cozy, and blissfully isolated. The elderly owner who handed me the keys mentioned that the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. Perfect, I thought. No distractions. The first few days were idyllic. I'd wake with the sun, spend my mornings writing on the small porch, and use the afternoons to explore the surrounding woods. The words flowed easier than they ever had before, inspired by the primal beauty of the forest. In the evenings, I'd sit by the fireplace, reading or planning the next day's chapters. I felt more at peace than I had in years. It was on the 4th day that I first noticed something odd. I was taking my usual afternoon walk when I saw it. A strange symbol carved into the trunk of the massive oak tree that stood at the edge of the small clearing where my cabin sat. It looked ancient, the edges weathered and grown over with lichen, but the shape was still clear, a circle bisected by a wavy line, with what looked like a crude eye at the center. I brushed it off as an old trail marker, maybe something left by early settlers or Native Americans. But as I continued my walk, I saw another symbol on a different tree, this one fresher, and another. By the time I made it back to the cabin, I'd counted 7 distinct markings, each similar but slightly different. That night, as I sat at my laptop trying to write, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling those symbols had given me. Every creak of the cabin's old timbers made me jump. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I was a city boy, unused to the sounds of the forest at night. But I still double-checked the locks before going to bed. I woke the next morning to find a new symbol carved into the porch railing, the wood still pale where the bark had been stripped away. My blood ran cold. This one was fresh, carved sometime during the night while I slept. Someone had been here, right outside my door. I spent the day inside, jumping at every sound, peering out the windows for any sign of movement. As dusk fell, I heard it, a faint whispering coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was just the wind in the trees, but as I listened, I realized it had a rhythm to it, almost like chanting. The words, if they were words, were too quiet to make out, but the sound sent shivers down my spine. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair facing the door, a heavy flashlight clutched in my hand like a weapon. The whispering continued, rising and falling like waves on a shore, sometimes so faint I thought it had stopped, other times loud enough that I was sure whatever was making the sound was right outside my door. When dawn finally broke, the forest fell silent. Exhausted and on edge, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to pack up and leave, novel be damned. But as I stepped outside to load up my car, my heart sank. The symbols had multiplied overnight. They now formed a complete circle around the cabin, carved into every tree at the edge of the clearing. I threw my bags into the car and fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, but wouldn't catch. I popped the hood, though I know next to nothing about cars. What I saw made my blood run cold. The battery was gone. Not dead, not disconnected, but completely removed. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. The nearest town was a good 20 miles away, through dense forest. Even if I could make the hike, I had no guarantee that whoever had taken my battery wouldn't follow me. I barricaded myself in the cabin, pushing the heavy wooden table in front of the door. As the day wore on, I noticed more symbols appearing on the trees surrounding the clearing, each one seeming to draw the circle tighter around me. The whispering started again as night fell, louder this time, close enough that I could almost make out words in a language I didn't recognize. I cowered in the center of the cabin, away from the windows, my eyes darting from door to door. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rough-hewn walls and the shadows that seemed to dance in the corners. Every creak, every groan of the old structure sounded like footsteps, like someone, or something, trying to get in. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I must have dozed off despite my terror. I woke with a start to silence. The whispering had stopped. Pale dawn light filtered through the windows, and for a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it had all been a terrible dream, a product of isolation and an overactive imagination. But when I looked down, that hope shattered. There, on the wooden floor all around me, were more symbols, dozens of them, burnt into the wood as if by a hot brand, forming a complex pattern with me at the center. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in short gasps. They had been in here. While I slept, they had been right here with me. I ran to the door, shoving the table aside with strength born of sheer panic. I had to get out, had to run, even if I had no idea where I was going. But as I yanked the door open, I froze. Standing in a semicircle around the cabin were figures in dark robes, their faces hidden by deep hoods. They stood perfectly still, silent, waiting. In the center was a taller figure, holding a staff carved with the same symbols I'd seen on the trees. The leader stepped forward, raising a hand in what might have been meant as a calming gesture. "We've been waiting for you," a voice said from within the hood, neither male nor female, but somehow both and neither at once. "You have been chosen." Chosen for what? I managed to croak out, my voice hoarse with fear. "To join us, to become part of something greater than yourself. The signs have been clear. Your arrival here was no accident." As the figure spoke, the others began to chant again, the same rhythmic sounds I'd heard through the night. I felt a strange pull, an urge to step forward and join them. It took every ounce of willpower I had to resist. "I don't understand," I said, gripping the doorframe to keep myself from moving closer. "What are you? What do you want from me?" The leader tilted their head, and though I couldn't see their face, I had the distinct impression they were smiling. We are the guardians of ancient knowledge, keepers of secrets long forgotten by the world of men. And you, my dear, have a role to play in the grand design. As they spoke, the chanting grew louder, more insistent. The symbols on the ground began to glow with an eerie light. I felt dizzy, my thoughts becoming fuzzy. Part of me wanted to give in, to let go and join whatever this was. But another part, the part that had always pushed me to question, to seek the truth, rebelled against the idea. In that moment of internal struggle, I made a decision. I ran, not towards the robed figures, but back into the cabin. I slammed the door shut and grabbed my backpack, shoving in whatever supplies I could reach. Then I ran for the back door, praying it wasn't guarded. To my relief, the back of the cabin was clear. I sprinted into the woods, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. The chanting had turned angry, threatening. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. When I couldn't run anymore, I found a dense thicket and crawled inside, making myself as small as possible. I lay there, barely breathing, listening to the sounds of my pursuers growing fainter. I don't know how long I stayed hidden. Hours, maybe. When I finally dared to move, the forest was quiet, save for the normal sounds of birds and small animals. Cautiously, I made my way back to the main trail, then followed it to the ranger station I'd passed on my way in. The rangers were skeptical of my story, of course. They found no trace of the robed figures, no strange symbols carved into trees. Even the cabin, when they checked it, was undisturbed. If it hadn't been for the new symbols I'd found branded into my own skin, small ones on the inside of my wrists, I might have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. I've spent years trying to understand what happened to me in those woods. I've researched obscure cults, ancient symbols, forgotten religions. I've never found any conclusive answers, but I've never stopped looking, because I know, deep down, that what I experienced was real. And I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, they'll come for me again. Every now and then I see a symbol out of the corner of my eye, carved into a tree in a city park, drawn in chalk on a sidewalk. And I wonder if I ever really escaped at all, or if I'm still playing a part in their grand design even now. The moment I saw his badge, I knew something was terribly wrong. No park ranger I'd ever met wore a uniform that shabby or carried a gun that wasn't standard issue. As he approached my campsite with that too wide smile, I realized I was alone in the wilderness with a very dangerous imposter. I've always been an avid camper, the type who seeks out the most remote spots in national parks. There's something about being alone in nature, far from the crowds and the noise of civilization, that speaks to my soul. So when I planned my week-long trip to Yellowstone, I made sure to secure a backcountry permit for one of the most isolated campsites in the park. The hike to my campsite was grueling but rewarding. As I set up my tent near a crystal-clear stream, with towering pines all around and snow-capped mountains in the distance, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was what I'd been craving. True solitude in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. The first couple of days were blissful. I spent my time hiking, taking photographs, and simply soaking in the majesty of my surroundings. In the evenings, I'd sit by my small campfire, watching the stars come out in a sky unspoiled by light pollution. I hadn't seen another soul since I'd left the main trail, and that was exactly how I liked it. On the third day, as I was returning from a long hike, I saw a figure approaching my campsite. My first reaction was annoyance. I'd chosen this spot specifically for its isolation, and I wasn't keen on company. But as the person got closer, I saw he was wearing what looked like a park ranger uniform, and my irritation turned to concern. Had something happened? Was there some sort of emergency? "Afternoon," the man called out as he got within earshot. "Just doing a routine check on backcountry campers. Mind if I take a look at your permit?" I nodded, reaching for my backpack where I kept my documentation, But as I did, I got my first good look at him, and something felt off. His uniform was ill-fitting and looked worn in a way that went beyond the normal wear and tear of backcountry work. The badge on his chest didn't quite catch the light the way it should, and the gun holstered at his hip. Well, I'd seen enough park rangers to know that wasn't standard issue. My heart began to race, but I forced myself to stay calm. I handed over my permit, watching carefully as he pretended to examine it. His eyes didn't move across the page the way they should if he were actually reading it. "Everything looks to be in order," he said, handing it back with that too wide smile. "Mind if I take a look around your campsite? Just standard procedure, you understand?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I was miles from any help, with no cell service and no way to alert anyone that something was wrong. As he poked around my campsite, asking questions that seemed just slightly off, too personal, or not quite what a real ranger would ask, I tried to formulate a plan. I couldn't run. He'd easily catch me in this terrain. I couldn't fight. He was bigger than me and armed. My only hope was to play along and look for an opportunity to escape or get help. "So," he said, turning back to me with that unsettling smile, "you out here all alone?" I hesitated, then made a split-second decision. "No, actually. My boyfriend is due back any minute. He just went to filter some water." His smile faltered for just a moment, and I knew I'd made the right choice. He was looking for an isolated target. "Oh, I didn't pass anyone on the trail," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "He probably took the route by the waterfall. It's a bit longer, but the view is worth it." He nodded slowly, and I could almost see the wheels turning in his head, recalculating his plans. "Well, I should probably stick around to check his permit too. Mind if I wait?" My heart sank. I'd bought myself some time, but now he wasn't going to leave. I nodded, gesturing to one of my camp chairs. "Of course. Would you like some water while you wait?" As I turned to my pack to get a water bottle, my mind was racing. I needed to find a way to signal for help or to get away from him. That's when I remembered my satellite messenger. It was small, designed to send pre-programmed messages or SOS signals in areas without cell service. I'd packed it as a precaution, never thinking I'd actually need to use it. I handed him the water bottle, then made a show of rummaging through my pack. "I'm just going to get started on dinner," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My boyfriend will probably be hungry when he gets back." He nodded, his eyes never leaving me as I moved around the campsite. I managed to palm the small device, keeping it hidden as I gathered my cooking supplies. As I knelt by the fire pit, pretending to arrange kindling, I pressed the SOS button. 3 short presses, 3 long, 3 short. The universal distress signal. I had no way of knowing if it had worked, but it was my only hope. "So, Ranger," I paused, realizing he'd never given me his name. "Johnson," he supplied quickly. "Ranger Johnson." I nodded, keeping my face neutral even as alarm bells rang in my head. No real ranger would have hesitated over their name. "Ranger Johnson, do you patrol this area often? It must be a challenging beat, being so remote." I kept him talking, asking questions about the park, about his job, about the wildlife in the area, anything to keep him distracted and to buy time. With each passing minute, I became more acutely aware of how isolated we were, how vulnerable I was. But I also knew that if my SOS had gone through, help would be on the way. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I saw his patience wearing thin. He kept glancing at the trail, then back at me, his hand straying closer to his gun. "Your boyfriend's been gone an awfully long time," he said, his voice losing its friendly pretense. "Are you sure he's coming back?" I opened my mouth to respond, to try to buy more time, when I heard it, the distant thrum of a helicopter. Relief flooded through me, making my knees weak. But I knew I wasn't safe yet. The man calling himself Ranger Johnson heard it too. His head snapped up, eyes scanning the sky. When he looked back at me, his face was twisted with rage. "What did you do?" he snarled, reaching for his gun. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I threw the pot of water I'd been heating for dinner at him and ran. I heard him curse, heard the sound of pursuit behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran like I'd never run before, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I burst out of the trees into a small clearing just as the helicopter appeared overhead. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The downdraft from the rotors whipped my hair around my face as it descended. 2 park rangers, real ones this time, jumped out before it had fully landed, their hands on their weapons. I pointed back the way I'd come, gasping out my story between heaving breaths. They radioed for backup as they moved into the trees to search for the imposter. The next few hours passed in a blur. More rangers arrived. The area was searched. Statements were taken. They found evidence of other campsites that had been disturbed, personal items left behind by hikers who had never made it home. But the man who had called himself Ranger Johnson was gone, vanished into the vast wilderness. As I was flown out of the backcountry to give a formal statement and identify photos of potential suspects, I looked down at the beautiful landscape below. The mountains and forests that had seemed so majestic now held a hint of menace. I knew that somewhere down there, a predator was still roaming free. I've been back to national parks since then. I still love the outdoors, still crave the peace of nature, but I'm more cautious now. I always hike with a partner, always leave detailed plans of my route, and I never, ever go anywhere without my satellite messenger, because I learned the hard way that even in the most beautiful places, danger can wear a friendly face. And sometimes, the most important survival skill is trusting your instincts when something doesn't feel right. The first gift was a perfectly arranged bundle of wildflowers. By the 3rd morning, when I found a hand-carved wooden figure outside my tent, I knew these weren't friendly offerings from a secret admirer. Someone was watching me, and they were getting closer. I've always been a solo camper. There's something about the solitude of the mountains that calls to me, a chance to clear my head and reconnect with nature. So when I planned a week-long trip to the Rockies, I was excited for the adventure ahead. I'd done my research, packed my gear meticulously, and set out with a spring in my step. The first couple of days were everything I'd hoped for. I hiked through pristine forests, alongside crystal-clear streams, and up to vistas that took my breath away. Each night, I'd set up camp in a different spot, always making sure to follow leave-no-trace principles. As I sat by my small campfire each evening, watching the stars come out in a sky unspoiled by light pollution, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. It was on the 3rd morning that things started to feel off. As I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the crisp mountain air, I noticed something placed carefully on a flat rock near my campfire pit. It was a small bundle of wildflowers, tied together with a piece of grass. At first, I thought maybe I'd gathered them myself the day before and forgotten about it. But as I picked them up, I realized these weren't just randomly picked flowers. They were artfully arranged, with an eye for color and composition that spoke of careful selection. A chill ran down my spine despite the warming morning sun. Someone had been here while I slept, close enough to leave this by my tent without waking me. I looked around, suddenly feeling exposed. The dense forest that had felt so welcoming now seemed full of hiding places, of watching eyes. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe another hiker had passed by and left them as a friendly gesture. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. I hadn't seen another soul since I'd left the trailhead 3 days ago. I packed up camp quickly that morning, deciding to hike further than I'd originally planned. As I walked, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, starting at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. The beauty of the landscape that had so enthralled me before now felt tainted by an undercurrent of menace. That night, I chose a campsite in a more open area, somewhere with clear lines of sight in all directions. I told myself it was for the view, but I knew I was hoping to spot anyone approaching. I slept fitfully, waking at every sound, my hand clutching the small canister of bear spray I'd brought along. The next morning, my heart sank as I saw another gift placed neatly outside my tent. This time it was a small, intricate dream catcher made from twigs and what looked like strands of horsehair. The craftsmanship was impressive, but all I felt was a growing sense of dread. This was no coincidence, no random act of kindness. Someone was following me, watching me, leaving these tokens while I slept. I packed up in record time, not even bothering to make breakfast. As I hiked, my mind raced through possibilities. Was it another camper who'd taken an unsettling interest in me? A local who resented hikers in their territory? Or something worse? I'd heard stories of people who preyed on isolated hikers in remote areas. I decided to deviate from my planned route, hoping to throw off whoever was following me. I pushed myself hard that day, covering much more ground than I'd intended, taking game trails and going off path when I could. By the time I set up camp that evening, my legs were aching and I was drenched in sweat, but I felt a glimmer of hope. Surely I'd lost them. That hope was shattered the next morning when I found the third gift, a small, hand-carved wooden figure placed right in front of my tent flap. It depicted a person, crude but recognizable, in a hiking pose. My blood ran cold as I realized it was meant to represent me. Panic set in. I was miles from the nearest town, with no cell service. Even if I started hiking back immediately, it would take at least 2 days to reach civilization. And clearly, changing my route hadn't thrown off my stalker. They knew these mountains better than I did. As I stood there, the little wooden figure clutched in my trembling hand, I heard a twig snap in the forest behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding. There, just at the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure, dressed in what looked like layers of tattered clothing, melted back into the shadows of the trees. I didn't think, I just ran. I left my tent, my sleeping bag, everything except the backpack I'd prepared for day hikes. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning as I gasped the thin mountain air. I had no plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and that campsite as possible. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing beside a small stream. As I lay there, gulping air, my mind started working again. I couldn't just run blindly. I needed a plan. I took stock of what I had: some water, a few energy bars, my first aid kit, a map and compass, and my emergency satellite beacon. I'd never had to use the beacon before, had hoped I never would, but now I was thanking my past self for insisting on bringing it. I activated the SOS signal, knowing it would alert search and rescue with my location, but I couldn't just stay put and wait for help. I had no idea how close my stalker was or what they wanted. I had to keep moving. I consulted my map, trying to orient myself. There was a ranger station marked about 15 miles to the east. If I pushed hard, I might be able to make it before nightfall. It was my best chance. As I hiked, every sense was on high alert. The forest that had seemed so peaceful just days ago now felt full of hidden threats. Every shadow might be hiding my pursuer. Every sound could be them getting closer. I found myself holding my breath as I walked, straining my ears for any sign of pursuit. The sun was low on the horizon when I finally spotted the ranger station. The sight of that small, rustic cabin was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I broke into a run, relief flooding through me as I burst through the door. The ranger inside jumped to his feet, startled by my sudden entrance. I must have looked a mess, wild-eyed, covered in scratches from pushing through undergrowth, gasping for breath. Between gulps of air, I managed to tell him my story. To his credit, he didn't question my tale or doubt my fear. He immediately radioed for backup and sat me down with a warm blanket and a cup of hot coffee. As the adrenaline wore off, I found myself shaking uncontrollably. the full weight of what I'd been through finally hitting me. The next few days were a blur of police statements, search parties, and sleepless nights in the safety of a motel in town. They found my abandoned campsite, but there was no sign of the mysterious figure I'd seen. The gifts I'd described were gone too, leaving the police with little evidence beyond my testimony. Some of the locals shared stories of a hermit who lived in those mountains, a man who'd gone off the grid decades ago and was rarely seen. Others dismissed it as nothing more than a legend, a campfire story to scare tourists. I didn't know what to believe anymore. I've been back home for weeks now, trying to put the experience behind me. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that crude wooden figure, a twisted mimicry of myself, and I wonder if I'd slept just a little deeper, stayed just a little longer, what would I have woken up to on that final morning? I still love the mountains, still feel the call of the wild, but I don't think I'll ever camp alone again, because now I know that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the wilderness are the ones that leave gifts and walk on two legs. The moment I saw the blood on his hands, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. What had started as an act of kindness on a remote hiking trail was quickly turning into a fight for survival, and I was miles from any hope of rescue. I've always been drawn to the less traveled paths, the hidden corners of the world that most people overlook. That's what led me to plan a solo hiking trip through one of the most remote areas of the Appalachian Trail. I'd done my research, packed my gear meticulously, and set out with a spring in my step, eager for the adventure ahead. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. I trekked through lush forests, climbed rocky outcroppings with breathtaking views, and slept under a canopy of stars so bright it seemed unreal. The solitude was exhilarating, a chance to clear my head and test my limits. It was on the fourth day that everything changed. I was making my way along a particularly challenging stretch of trail, the path narrow and rocky, hugging the side of a steep incline. The sound of running water told me there was a stream nearby, though I couldn't see it through the dense undergrowth. That's when I heard it. A cry of pain, followed by a weak call for help. I froze, listening intently. It came again, definitely human, definitely in distress. Without hesitation, I left the trail, pushing through the thick foliage towards the sound. I found him at the bottom of a small ravine, lying awkwardly beside the stream I'd heard. He was a middle-aged man, lean and weathered, with a scraggly beard and clothes that had seen better days. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and he was clutching his side, his breathing labored. "Thank God," he gasped as he saw me. "I thought I was done for." I scrambled down to him, my first aid training kicking in as I assessed his injuries. The leg was definitely broken, and from the way he was holding his ribs, I suspected at least one of those was cracked too. "What happened?" I asked, as I dug through my pack for my first aid kit. "Slipped," he said, wincing as he tried to shift position. "Been down here since yesterday. Thought I was going to die here." My heart went out to him. The thought of being injured and alone in such a remote area was terrifying. "I'm going to help you," I assured him, "but we need to get you to a hospital. Do you have a satellite phone or an emergency beacon?" He shook his head, his eyes never leaving my face. "Nothing. You're the first person I've seen in days." I nodded, trying to hide my concern. We were at least 2 days a hike from the nearest town, and in his condition, moving him was going to be a challenge. But I couldn't just leave him here. "Okay," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'm going to splint your leg, and then we'll figure out how to get you out of here. What's your name?" "Tom," he said, managing a weak smile. "And you're a damn saint for finding me." I returned the smile, introducing myself as I set about creating a makeshift splint from branches and strips torn from my spare t-shirt. As I worked, I chatted with Tom, partly to distract him from the pain and partly to keep my own nerves at bay. He told me he was an experienced hiker who'd been exploring this area for years. "Know these mountains like the back of my hand," he said proudly. Or at least I thought I did. Guess they still had a surprise for me. With his legs splinted and his ribs wrapped as best I could manage, I helped Tom to his feet. He leaned heavily on me, his face pale with pain. I knew there was no way he could make it back up the steep sides of the ravine. "We'll follow the stream," I decided. "It has to lead somewhere, and the going will be easier on flat ground." Tom nodded, seemingly relieved to have someone else making the decisions. We set off at a painfully slow pace, Tom hobbling along with my support, stopping frequently for him to rest. As we walked, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Something about the situation felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Maybe it was the way Tom's eyes darted around constantly, or the fact that for someone who claimed to know the area so well, he seemed uncertain about which direction we should be heading. We made camp as night fell, my small tent barely big enough for the two of us. I insisted Tom take my sleeping bag, using my emergency blanket for myself. As I lay there in the darkness, listening to Tom's ragged breathing, I tried to shake off my paranoia. The poor man was injured and scared. Of course he was acting a bit strange. The next morning, as I changed the dressing on Tom's leg, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The injury, which I hadn't examined closely in the dim light of the previous evening, didn't look like it had been caused by a fall. The edges were too clean, too straight. It looked more like a cut, a deliberate wound. I must have flinched, because Tom's hand suddenly clamped down on my wrist. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice no longer weak and pained, but low and dangerous. I looked up, meeting his eyes, and in that moment, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The fear and gratitude I'd seen before were gone, replaced by a cold, calculating look that made my skin crawl. "No," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just worried about infection. We should get moving if we want to make it to help soon." Tom's grip on my wrist tightened. "Oh, I don't think we'll be going anywhere just yet," he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You see, I've been waiting for someone like you to come along. Someone helpful, someone trusting, someone who wouldn't be missed for a while." My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. This man, this predator, had been lying in wait, playing injured to lure in unsuspecting hikers, and I'd walked right into his trap. In a burst of adrenaline, I yanked my arm free and scrambled backwards, out of the tent. But Tom was faster than I'd expected. He lunged after me, all pretense of injury gone, tackling me to the ground. We struggled, rolling across the forest floor. I fought with everything I had, knowing my life depended on it. My fingers scrabbled in the dirt, searching for a rock, a stick, anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a hefty branch just as Tom pinned me down, his weight crushing the air from my lungs. With every ounce of strength I had left, I swung the branch, connecting solidly with the side of his head. Tom went limp, collapsing on top of me. For a terrifying moment, I thought I'd killed him. But then I heard a low groan as I pushed him off. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, leaving behind my tent, my supplies, everything except the clothes on my back. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get as far away from Tom as possible. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing beside a small stream. As I lay there, gulping air, my mind started working again. I couldn't just run blindly. I needed a plan. I took stock of what I had, which was practically nothing. No food, no water, no map. Just the clothes I was wearing and the emergency whistle I always kept on a cord around my neck. I knew I couldn't stay put. Tom might be following me, and in these woods, he had the advantage. He knew the terrain, probably had supplies stashed away. My only hope was to keep moving, to try to find my way back to civilization before he found me. For 3 days, I pushed myself to my limits. I followed streams, hoping they'd lead to rivers and eventually to towns. I ate berries I recognized as safe, drank from clear running water, and slept in short bursts, too afraid to rest for long. All the while, I blew my whistle at regular intervals, praying someone would hear it. On the fourth day, when my strength was almost gone and I was beginning to lose hope, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a helicopter. I stumbled into a clearing, waving my arms frantically, and collapsed as I saw the search and rescue team rappelling down. The aftermath was a blur of hospital stays, police interviews, and search parties sent to find Tom. They never did, though they found evidence of other victims at his campsite. The police told me I was lucky to have escaped, that my story might help them catch a predator who'd been active in the area for years. I don't feel lucky. I feel naive, foolish for having walked so willingly into such a dangerous situation. But I also feel changed. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the darker side of human nature. But I haven't let it kill my love for the wilderness or my belief in the goodness of most people. I still hike, still seek out those remote trails and hidden corners of the world. But now I go prepared not just for the challenges of nature, but for the potential darkness that can lurk in the hearts of those we meet along the way. Because sometimes, the most dangerous predators in the wilderness are the ones that walk on two legs and ask for help. The first whisper was so faint I thought I'd imagined it. By the third night, when the voices grew loud enough to make out words, I knew I wasn't alone in this vast desert, and whatever was out there wasn't human. I've always been drawn to extreme environments. The harsher the landscape, the more alive I feel. So when I planned a solo camping trip to the Sonoran Desert, I was thrilled by the challenge. I'd done my research, packed my gear meticulously, and set out with a spring in my step, eager to test myself against one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. I hiked through a landscape that seemed almost alien, towering saguaro cacti reaching towards the cloudless sky, rocky outcroppings shimmering in the heat haze, and a silence so profound it seemed to have a weight all its own. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, I set up my camp in the shelter of a large rock formation. That night, as I lay in my tent staring up at a sky so full of stars it looked like spilled sugar across black velvet, I heard it for the first time. A whisper, so faint I could have easily mistaken it for the wind if there had been any wind. But the air was still, the desert locked in the grip of a heat that didn't relent even after sundown. I sat up, straining my ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but that profound silence. Then I heard it again, a soft susurration, like someone whispering just at the edge of hearing. I unzipped my tent and peered out, my headlamp cutting a bright swath through the darkness. But there was nothing to see, just the looming shadows of cacti and rocks. I told myself I was imagining things, that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. I'd heard stories of the desert's ability to induce hallucinations, of mirages that weren't just visual but auditory too. I zipped the tent back up and tried to sleep, but rest was a long time coming. The next day, I pushed myself hard, hiking further than I'd planned. Part of me hoped that if I exhausted myself physically, I'd be too tired for my mind to conjure up phantom sounds. The desert seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, a sea of sand and stone beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at. As night fell, I made camp in a small canyon, the high walls providing some relief from the relentless heat. I sat outside my tent long into the night, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the absolute silence of the desert. Just as I was about to turn in, I heard it again. This time, the whisper was clearer, closer. I whirled around, my headlamp beam dancing across the canyon walls. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the still air. "Is someone there?" No response came, but as I stood there, heart pounding, I could have sworn I heard a soft chuckle, quickly stifled. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat with my back against the canyon wall, jumping at every shadow, every shift of sand. The third day dawned bright and brutally hot. I broke camp early, eager to be moving, to put distance between myself and whatever I'd heard in the night. But as I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned to look behind me, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I focused on it, there was nothing there. By the time I made camp that evening, my nerves were frayed. I was jumpy, starting at every sound, every shadow. As darkness fell, the whispers started again, but this time they were louder, clearer, and there was more than one voice. They seemed to come from all around me, a cacophony of whispers that rose and fell like waves on a shore. I huddled in my tent, hands pressed against my ears, but it didn't help. The voices seemed to be inside my head as much as outside. And then, to my horror, I began to make out words. "He's here," one voice hissed, a sound like dry leaves scraping across stone. "I've fresh meat," another replied, and I could hear the hunger in its tone. "It's been so long," a third chimed in, its voice dripping with anticipation. I was shaking uncontrollably, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a product of heat and isolation and fear. But it felt real, terrifyingly real. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it rang in my ears. Then slowly, they started again. But this time they were all saying the same thing, over and over, building to a crescendo that made my head throb. "Come out, come out, come out." I don't know what made me do it. Fear, curiosity, or maybe some deep-seated instinct for self-preservation. But I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the night. The desert was bathed in moonlight, every rock and cactus casting long, deep shadows. And in those shadows I saw them. Shapes that weren't quite solid, weren't quite real, but were undeniably there. They flitted at the edges of my vision, never quite still enough to focus on me, but unmistakably present. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The shapes moved closer, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. One of them spoke, its voice like sand grinding against glass. "We are the forgotten," it said, "the lost, the ones the desert claimed long ago." "We've been waiting," another added, its form shifting and writhing in a way that made my eyes hurt to look at it. "Waiting for someone like you." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, watching as these impossible beings circled around me. "Why me?" I managed to ask. "Because you came willingly," a third voice replied, and I could hear the smile in its tone. "Because you sought out the emptiness, the isolation, you opened yourself to us." They were getting closer, their insubstantial forms beginning to coalesce into something more solid, more real. I could make out features now, eyes that glowed with an inner light, mouths filled with teeth that looked sharp enough to tear through reality itself. "What do you want from me?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "Everything," they replied in unison, their voices merging into a sound that made my bones vibrate. "Your fear, your wonder, your very essence. We want you to join us, to become part of the desert, part of the eternal emptiness." They were almost upon me now, their forms solidifying with each passing second. I could feel their cold touch on my skin, like tendrils of mist wrapping around me. In that moment, faced with the impossible, with entities that shouldn't exist in any sane world, something in me snapped. The paralysis that had gripped me broke, and I ran. I ran like I've never run before, heedless of direction or danger. I scrambled over rocks, crashed through patches of cactus, ignoring the thorns that tore at my skin. Behind me, I could hear them pursuing, their whispers rising to a howl that echoed across the desert. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, I saw something that made my heart leap. A road, cutting through the desert like a black ribbon. With the last of my strength, I staggered onto the asphalt and collapsed. As the sun rose, I heard a final whisper, fading like mist in the morning light. "We'll be waiting." I was found hours later by a passing truck driver, dehydrated, covered in cuts and bruises, babbling about voices in the dark. They put it down to heat stroke, to the harsh realities of the desert playing tricks on an unprepared mind. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened out there. Who would believe me? Sometimes, I'm not sure I believe it myself, but on quiet nights, when the wind whispers around the corners of my house, I find myself straining to hear, half afraid and half hoping to catch the words hidden in the sound. The desert changed me. I no longer seek out empty places or test myself against harsh environments, but sometimes, in my dreams, I'm back there, surrounded by those shifting shapes, those hungry voices, and I wonder if, in some way, a part of me is still there, lost in the vastness of the Sonoran desert, whispering with the others in the dark. The moment I saw the speedboat packed with unmarked crates, I knew I'd stumbled onto something I was never meant to see. What had started as a peaceful solo kayaking trip was about to turn into a desperate fight for survival against forces I couldn't begin to understand. I've always loved the water. There's something about the rhythmic motion of paddling, the gentle lapping of waves against the hull, that soothes my soul like nothing else. So when I decided to take a week-long solo kayaking trip along the coast of Northern California, I was ecstatic. I'd planned my route carefully, mapping out secluded coves and hidden beaches where I could camp each night, far from the crowds and noise of civilization. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. I paddled through crystal-clear waters, marveling at the kelp forests swaying beneath me and the seals that would pop their heads up to watch me curiously as I passed. Each evening, I'd pull my kayak up onto a deserted beach, set up my small tent, and fall asleep to the sound of waves gently breaking on the shore. It was on the fourth day that everything changed. I was hugging the coastline, admiring the rugged cliffs rising up from the water, when I spotted a narrow opening in the rock face. Intrigued, I steered my kayak towards it. As I got closer, I realized it was the entrance to a hidden cove, completely invisible from the main shoreline. My heart raced with excitement as I paddled into the cove. This was exactly the kind of secret spot I'd been hoping to find. The cove was small, maybe 100 yards across, with a crescent of sandy beach at the back. Steep cliffs rose on all sides, making it feel like a private little world. I beached my kayak and stretched my legs, walking along the water's edge. That's when I noticed something odd. Fresh tire tracks in the sand, leading up to a narrow path that wound its way up the cliff face. It seemed strange in such an isolated spot, but I figured maybe local fishermen knew about this place. Curious, I decided to follow the path. It was steep and rough, clearly not meant for casual hikers. By the time I reached the top, I was breathing hard and my legs were burning. But what I saw made me forget all about my fatigue. There, in a small clearing just back from the cliff edge, was a speedboat on a trailer. It was sleek and expensive looking, the kind of vessel you'd expect to see in a Miami marina, not hidden away in a remote cove in Northern California. But it was what was in the boat that really caught my attention. It was packed with wooden crates, their sides stamped with symbols I didn't recognize. I knew I should leave, that I was seeing something I probably shouldn't. But curiosity got the better of me. I crept closer, straining to make out the markings on the crates. They weren't in English, or any language I recognized. Some of the symbols looked almost like hieroglyphs, while others seemed to shift and change as I looked at them, making my eyes hurt. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard voices coming up the path. Panic seized me. I looked around wildly for a place to hide, finally ducking behind a large boulder just as two men crested the top of the path. They were talking in low voices, in a language I didn't understand. From my hiding spot, I could see them clearly. They were dressed casually in jeans and t-shirts, but something about the way they moved, alert and purposeful, made me think they weren't just ordinary smugglers. One of them went to the boat and opened one of the crates. I had to stifle a gasp. Inside, nestled in what looked like black sand, was an object that seemed to defy description. It was roughly spherical, but its surface rippled and moved like it was alive. It glowed with an inner light that shifted through colors I'd never seen before, hues that shouldn't exist. The man picked it up carefully, almost reverently. As he turned with it in his hands, I saw his face clearly for the first time. His eyes were completely black, no whites visible at all. A chill ran down my spine. Whatever these men were, they weren't human. I must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath or a rustle of clothing, because suddenly both men turned towards my hiding place. I didn't wait to see if they'd spotted me. I ran. I crashed back down the path, my feet slipping on loose rocks, branches whipping at my face. I could hear shouts behind me, followed by the sound of pursuit. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. I burst out onto the beach and sprinted for my kayak. Just as I reached it, a hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. I found myself face to face with one of the men, his black eyes boring into mine. Up close, I could see that his skin had an odd, shimmery quality to it, like the scales of a fish. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice oddly melodic despite the menace in his tone. "You've seen too much." I reacted on instinct, bringing my knee up hard. He doubled over with a grunt, and I took the opportunity to shove him away. I dragged my kayak into the water and jumped in, paddling furiously. As I cleared the mouth of the cove, I heard an unearthly shriek behind me. I glanced back to see both men standing at the water's edge. One of them raised his hand, and to my horror, the water around my kayak began to churn and bubble. Shapes rose from the depths, creatures that looked like a nightmarish cross between sharks and humans. Their skin was pale and rubbery, their mouths filled with row upon a row of razor-sharp teeth. They circled my kayak, their black eyes fixed on me with predatory intent. I paddled harder than I ever had in my life, my arms burning with the effort. The creatures kept pace easily, occasionally bumping against my kayak or snapping at my paddle. I knew I couldn't outrun them forever. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard the sound of a motor. A Coast Guard cutter appeared around the headland and headed in my direction. The creatures immediately dove, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. As the cutter pulled alongside me, I realized I was shaking uncontrollably. The Coast Guard officers helped me aboard, wrapping me in a blanket and peppering me with questions. I babbled about smugglers and hidden coves, but I didn't mention the impossible things I'd seen. Who would believe me? They searched the cove, of course, but found nothing. No boat, no crates, no sign that anyone had been there at all. They put it down to sunstroke and dehydration, a kayaker's imagination running wild. But I know what I saw. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see that strange, living sphere, glowing with impossible colors. I can still feel the cold, alien touch of that not-quite-human hand on my shoulder. I don't go kayaking anymore, at least not in the ocean. I stick to lakes now, places where I can always see the shore. But sometimes, when I'm near the coast, I find myself scanning the water, looking for shapes moving beneath the surface. And I wonder about those crates, about what was in them, and about what plans those not-quite-human smugglers had for their otherworldly cargo. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to find any information about similar sightings or experiences. I've delved into obscure forums and fringe websites, searching for answers. But the deeper I dig, the more questions I uncover. There are whispers in certain circles about an ancient race that predates humanity, beings that retreated to the depths of the oceans millennia ago. Some say they're returning now, reclaiming what was once theirs. Others insist they've always been here, hiding in plain sight, manipulating human affairs from the shadows. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that the world is stranger and more dangerous than I ever imagined. And somewhere out there, in hidden coves and secret places, impossible things are being smuggled for purposes I can't even begin to fathom. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself drawn to the shore. I stand there, watching the waves and listening to the rhythm of the ocean, and I wonder if, somewhere out in that vast expanse of water, those black-eyed beings are watching me back, waiting for the day they can reclaim the surface world as their own. I never reported what I saw to the authorities. Who would believe such a fantastical tale? But I keep my eyes open, and I stay alert, because now I know that there are things lurking in the depths of our world that defy explanation, things that most people couldn't even imagine. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you might just stumble upon them in the most unexpected places. So if you're ever out on the water and you see something that doesn't quite make sense, something that shouldn't be there, don't investigate. Don't let curiosity get the better of you like I did. Just turn around and paddle away as fast as you can. Because some secrets are better left undiscovered, some mysteries better left unsolved, and the depths of the ocean hold terrors beyond our wildest nightmares. The moment I saw all 4 tires slashed, I knew this wasn't just bad luck. Someone didn't want me to leave. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. I've always been drawn to the road less traveled, seeking out hidden gems that most tourists overlook. That's what led me to this remote corner of a national park, miles from the nearest campground or ranger station. I'd read about a secluded spot with breathtaking views and unparalleled solitude. It seemed perfect for a weekend of camping and photography. The drive there was an adventure in itself. My old Jeep groaned as I navigated the increasingly rough dirt roads, the GPS signal flickering in and out. By the time I reached the small clearing that would be my campsite, I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours. As I set up my tent and organized my gear, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. This was real wilderness, unspoiled and raw. The late afternoon sun painted the landscape in warm hues, and I spent the first few hours capturing the play of light on the rugged terrain. It wasn't until I returned to my campsite that evening that I noticed something odd. My cooler, which I'd left on the picnic table, was slightly ajar. At first, I thought maybe I'd forgotten to secure it properly, but as I got closer, I saw distinct claw marks on the plastic. Something had been trying to get in. A chill ran down my spine despite the warm evening air. I'd been careful to store my food properly, knowing that bears were active in the area. But these marks didn't look like bear claws. They were smaller, more deliberate. I shook off the unease, chalking it up to an overly curious raccoon. I secured my food in the Jeep and turned in for the night, the sounds of the wilderness lulling me to sleep. The next morning, I woke early, eager to catch the sunrise from a nearby ridge. As I emerged from my tent, I immediately sensed that something was wrong. The campsite felt different, though I couldn't put my finger on why. It wasn't until I'd returned from my morning shoot that I noticed the first real sign of trouble. My backpack, which I'd left in the Jeep, was sitting on the picnic table. I know I hadn't taken it out. My heart began to race as I approached it cautiously. The contents had been rifled through, but nothing seemed to be missing. Instead, something had been added. A small, crudely woven bracelet made of grass and twigs lay on top of my gear. Threaded through its center was a single long, coarse hair, too thick to be human, too long to belong to any animal I knew. My hands shook as I examined it. This was no animal. Someone had been here, had gone through my things while I was away. The realization sent a jolt of fear through me. I was alone, miles from help, and someone was watching me. I decided then and there to pack up and leave. This was no longer the peaceful retreat I'd envisioned. But as I started gathering my gear, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the distinct hiss of air escaping a tire. I ran to my Jeep, my heart pounding, All four tires were flat, each one sporting a clean slice along the sidewall. This was no accident, no unfortunate encounter with a sharp rock. Someone had deliberately stranded me here. Panic set in as I realized the gravity of my situation. I had no cell service, no way to call for help. The nearest road was miles away, too far to walk safely with the limited supplies I had. I was well and truly trapped. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, I frantically tried to come up with a plan. I gathered everything I could in my tent: food, water, my camera gear, anything that might be useful. I found a heavy flashlight that could double as a weapon if needed. But deep down, I knew I was woefully unprepared for whatever, or whoever, was out there. Night fell, and with it came a silence so profound it seemed to press in on me from all sides. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I sat in my tent, flashlight clutched in my sweaty hand, straining my ears for any sound of approach. It was well past midnight when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there was more than one set. They moved in perfect synchronization, a steady, rhythmic sound that seemed to penetrate my very bones. I wanted to call out, to demand to know who was there, but fear had stolen my voice. The footsteps continued their relentless circuit, never speeding up, never slowing down, just that steady, menacing pace. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, the footsteps receded. I waited, hardly daring to breathe, for what felt like hours. When I finally found the courage to unzip my tent and peer outside, what I saw made my heart skip a beat. Surrounding my campsite, just at the edge of the clearing, were crude figures made of sticks and grass. They stood about waist high, their features twisted into grotesque approximations of human faces. Each one wore a bracelet identical to the one I'd found in my backpack. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This was beyond simple vandalism or theft. This was something else entirely, something I couldn't begin to comprehend. In the growing light, I noticed something else. A trail, barely visible, leading away from my campsite into the dense underbrush. It hadn't been there the day before. I was certain of it. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to wait for help that might never come. But a deeper part of me knew that staying here, surrounded by those eerie totems, would drive me mad long before any rescue arrived. With shaking hands, I packed a small bag with water, some energy bars, and my flashlight. I left a note in my tent explaining what had happened and which direction I was heading, though I held little hope anyone would find it in time to help. The trail was rough, overgrown in places, and seemed to wind aimlessly through the wilderness. But I pressed on, driven by a desperate need to put distance between myself and that nightmarish campsite. As I walked, I became aware of sounds in the forest around me. Not the normal sounds of birds or small animals, but something else. Whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The crack of a branch breaking underfoot, always just out of sight. I walked for hours, the sun climbing high in the sky, then beginning its descent. The trail never seemed to end, never led to a road or any sign of civilization. As dusk approached, I realized with growing horror that the path had led me in a giant circle. Ahead, I could see my campsite through the trees, but it wasn't as I'd left it. My tent was gone, replaced by a larger structure made of branches and animal hides. The crude figures had multiplied, now numbering in the dozens, all turned to face the center of the clearing where a fire burned. And gathered around that fire were people. At least, they looked like people at first glance. But as I watched, hidden behind a large tree, I realized there was something fundamentally wrong about them. Their movements were too fluid, their limbs slightly too long, and their eyes, when they turned to look in my direction, glowed with an inner light that was anything but human. One of them stood, sniffing the air, and I knew with certainty that I had been detected. As they began to move towards me, I ran. I ran like I've never run before, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, my lungs burning and my legs screaming in protest. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, collapsing in a small gully as the last light faded from the sky. As I lay there, gasping for breath, I heard them. They were singing, a beautiful, terrible melody that seemed to come from the earth itself. It grew louder, closer, and I knew they were coming for me. I'd like to say I faced my fate with courage, meaning that I stood my ground against the unknown. But the truth is, as those unearthly voices drew near and inhuman shapes began to emerge from the darkness, I closed my eyes and prayed for it to be over quickly. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed, surrounded by concerned doctors and stern-faced rangers. They told me I'd been found wandering along a highway, dehydrated and babbling about monsters in the woods. My campsite, when they found it, showed no signs of disturbance. No slashed tires, no stick figures, no strange structures, just an abandoned tent and a lot of unanswered questions. I know what I saw, what I experienced, but I also know that no one will ever believe me. Sometimes late at night I still hear that singing, calling me back to the wilderness, and I wonder, not for the first time, if I ever truly escaped at all.